Welcome back to part 2 of Frankenstein, Reimagined. In this episode, Victor Frankenstein pursues his creation across Europe, driven by a desire for vengeance after the creature murders his loved ones. The pursuit culminates in the Arctic, where Victor succumbs to exhaustion and dies. The creature, filled with remorse and despair, vows to end his own life and disappears into the icy wilderness. The story concludes with themes of ambition, revenge, and the tragic consequences of defying natural boundaries, leaving a haunting reflection on human aspiration and isolation.
Chapter 12. I now hurry to the heart-wrenching part of my story, the events that transformed me from what I was into what I am. Spring burst forth with a vengeance, the weather turned delightful, and the skies stretched out a flawless blue canvas. It amazed me how a place that was once bleak and barren could now be alive with the most beautiful flowers and lush greenery. My senses were bathed in 1,000 delightful fragrances and 1,000 mesmerizing sights. One day, when my cottagers took their periodic break from labor, the old man played his guitar and the children gathered around him. But Felix's face was a mask of melancholy. He sighed often. At one point, his father paused the music and seemed to inquire about his son's sorrow. Felix responded in a cheerful tone, but it was clear the sorrow ran deep. Just then, a knock echoed at the door. A lady on horseback, escorted by a local guide, stood at the entrance. She was cloaked in dark attire, a thick black veil concealing her face. Agatha asked a question, and the lady replied softly, her voice a sweet melody, pronouncing the name Felix. The name seemed to be magic. Felix rushed to the door, and the lady, upon seeing him, threw back her veil to reveal a face of angelic beauty. Raven-black hair framed her delicate features, and her dark eyes sparkled with a gentle yet animated light. Her cheeks were a perfect pink against her fair complexion. Felix's sorrow melted away in an instant, replaced by an ecstatic joy that transformed his face. His eyes sparkled, his cheeks flushed with pleasure. At that moment, he was as beautiful as the lady before him. She, too, was moved, but in a different way. Tears glistened in her eyes. She held out her hand to Felix, who kissed it fervently, calling her his sweet Arabian. She smiled, not understanding his words, but feeling his emotion. Felix helped her dismount and dismissed her guide, leading her into the cottage. A conversation ensued between him and his father, during which the young stranger knelt before the old man, attempting to kiss his hand. He raised her and embraced her with great affection. I soon realized that although she spoke, she was not understood by the cottagers, nor did she understand them. They communicated with gestures, and her presence seemed to dispel their sorrow, bringing joy to the household. Felix was particularly joyful, welcoming his Arabian with delighted smiles. Agatha, ever gentle, kissed the stranger's hands and indicated that Felix had been sorrowful until her arrival. Hours passed with an air of mystery and happiness I couldn't fully comprehend. The stranger tried to learn their language, repeating words after them. It struck me that I could use the same method to learn as well. She mastered about 20 words in the first lesson, most of which I already knew, but I eagerly picked up the new ones. As night fell, Agatha and the Arabian retired early. Felix kissed the stranger's hand, wishing her good night, sweet Safi. He stayed up late, talking with his father, frequently mentioning her name. I desperately wanted to understand their conversation, but found it impossible. The next morning, Felix went out to work. After Agatha finished her chores, Sophie sat at the old man's feet and played the guitar, her music so enchanting it brought tears of both sorrow and delight to my eyes. She sang with a voice that flowed like a nightingale, rising and falling in rich cadences. When she finished, she handed the guitar to Agatha, who initially hesitated but then played a simple tune, her voice sweet but not as wondrous as Sophie's. The old man was enraptured, expressing his delight, which Agatha tried to convey to Sophie. Days passed peacefully, now filled with joy instead of sadness. Sophie was always cheerful, and she and I rapidly improved our knowledge of the language. In 2 months, I could understand most of the words spoken by my protectors. Meanwhile, the black ground bloomed with greenery, and flowers of every hue adorned the landscape. The sun's warmth increased, the nights became clear and balmy, and my nocturnal adventures brought me immense pleasure. However, they were shorter due to the longer daylight, for I never ventured out during the day, fearing a repeat of the cruel treatment I had endured in the first village I entered. My days were spent obsessively learning their language. I picked it up faster than Sophie, who struggled with broken sentences, while I understood and could mimic almost every word they said. As I improved my speech, I also delved into the science of letters, mirroring the stranger's lessons. This opened a vast field of wonder and delight. The book Felix used to teach Sophie was Volney's Ruins of Empires. Had Felix not explained it so thoroughly, I wouldn't have grasped its meaning. He chose this book for its style, modeled after Eastern authors. Through it, I gained a brief history of various empires and insights into the cultures, governments, and religions of the world. I learned of the idle Asiatics, the genius of the Greeks, the valor of the early Romans, their decline, and the rise of chivalry, Christianity, and monarchies. I even heard about the discovery of America and wept with Sophie over the fate of its native inhabitants. These stories stirred strange feelings in me. Was humanity so powerful, so virtuous, yet so vile and base? Men appeared both noble and godlike, yet also mere agents of evil. To be great and virtuous seemed the highest honor, to be base and vile, the lowest degradation. For a long time, I couldn't fathom why one man would murder another or why laws and governments existed. But as I heard more about vice and bloodshed, my confusion faded into disgust and loathing. Every conversation among the cottagers revealed new marvels. Felix's instructions to Sophie explained the intricate system of human society. I learned about the division of property, immense wealth, and squalid poverty, about rank, descent, and noble blood. These lessons led me to reflect on myself. I realized that what society valued most were high status and wealth. A man might be respected with just one of these attributes, but without either, he was deemed a vagabond, a slave, destined to waste his potential for the benefit of the privileged few. And what was I? Ignorant of my creation and creator, without money, friends, or property. I was hideously deformed, not even of the same nature as humans. I was more agile, could endure extreme temperatures, and my stature far exceeded theirs. I saw and heard of no one like me. Was I a monster, a blot on the earth from which all men fled? The agony of these thoughts was unbearable. I tried to dispel them, but sorrow only grew with knowledge. I wished I had stayed in my native woods, unaware of anything beyond the basic needs. Knowledge is a strange thing. Once it grips the mind, it clings like a lichen to a rock. I wished to shake off all thoughts and feelings, but learned there was only one way to end pain: death, a state I feared but didn't understand. I admired the virtue and goodness, loved the gentle manners of my cottagers, but was shut out from interacting with them except by stealth. The kind words of Agatha, the charming smiles of Safie, the wise advice of the old man, and the lively conversation of Felix were not for me. I was a miserable, unhappy wretch. Other lessons cut even deeper. I learned about the differences between sexes, the birth and growth of children, how fathers adored their infants' smiles, and mothers dedicated their lives to their precious charges. I learned about the expansion of young minds and the relationships of brother, sister, and family bonds. But where were my friends and relations? No father had watched over my infant days, no mother had blessed me with smiles and caresses. From my earliest memory, I had been as I was, fully grown. I had never seen another being like me or anyone who claimed a connection to me. What was I? The question tormented me, answered only with groans. I will soon explain where these feelings led me, but let me first return to the cottagers, whose story filled me with a mix of indignation, delight, and wonder, ultimately deepening my love and reverence for my protectors as I innocently and painfully deceived myself into calling them. Chapter 13. Some time passed before I unearthed the history of my friends. The tale was gripping, a vivid tapestry woven from the threads of circumstance, each thread a revelation to someone as inexperienced as I was. The old man's name was de Lacy, a name that echoed with the vestiges of a good French lineage. He had lived many years in affluence, respected by his superiors, adored by his peers. His son, Felix, had served his country, while Agatha had moved among the elite, ranking with ladies of the highest distinction. Just months before my arrival, they had resided in the grand city of Paris, surrounded by friends and bathed in the comforts that virtue, intellect, and taste, coupled with a moderate fortune, could provide. Their downfall was triggered by Safi's father, a Turkish merchant who had lived in Paris for many years. For reasons I couldn't entirely grasp, he had become a target for the government. The very day Safie arrived from Constantinople, her father was arrested and thrown into prison. He was tried and sentenced to death. The injustice of his conviction was blatant, inciting outrage across Paris. It was clear his religion and wealth, rather than any real crime, had sealed his fate. Felix had been present at the trial by chance. His horror and indignation at the court's decision were uncontrollable. He vowed then and there to free the Turk and immediately began plotting. After numerous failed attempts to access the prison, he found a heavily grated window in an unguarded part of the building, which illuminated the dungeon of the despairing prisoner. Felix visited the grate at night, revealing his plan to the captive. The Turk, astonished and elated, tried to ignite Felix's zeal with promises of wealth and reward. Felix scorned his offers, but was profoundly moved when he saw the lovely Safie, who was permitted to visit her father. Her gestures of gratitude sparked a fire in Felix's heart, making him realize that the prisoner possessed a treasure worth all his risks. The Turk quickly saw the effect his daughter had on Felix and tried to secure his loyalty by promising Safie's hand in marriage once he was safely out of Paris. Felix, too honorable to accept outright, nevertheless hoped for this promise's fulfillment as the pinnacle of his happiness. As the days rolled by and plans for the merchant's escape took shape, Felix's zeal was stoked by letters from Safie. She found a way to express her gratitude and thoughts in Felix's language with the help of an old servant who knew French. Her words were a balm, thanking him fervently for his efforts and lamenting her own fate. I managed to acquire the tools for writing during my stay in the hovel and made copies of these letters, often found in the hands of Felix or Agatha. Before I leave, I'll give them to you. They will verify my story. But for now, as the sun is setting, I'll share only the essence of those letters. Safi shared that her mother was a Christian Arab, seized and enslaved by the Turks. With her striking beauty, she captivated Safi's father, who married her. Safi spoke of her mother with admiration and reverence. Born free, her mother detested the chains of bondage and instilled in Safi the principles of her faith, urging her to strive for intellectual independence and a spirit unbroken by societal norms. Her mother's teachings left an indelible mark on Safi. The thought of returning to Asia, trapped within the confines of a harem, filled her with dread. She longed for a life that matched her grand ideas and noble aspirations. The prospect of marrying a Christian and living in a society where women could hold a status was intoxicatingly appealing. The execution date for Safi's father was set, but the night before he escaped his cell and by morning was far from Paris. Felix had secured passports under his family's name. He had informed his father of the plan, who, playing his part, left his home under the guise of a journey and hid with Agatha in a remote part of Paris. Felix guided the fugitives through France to Lyons and across Mont Cenis to Leghorn, where the merchant planned to find a way back to the Turkish dominions. Safi decided to stay with her father until he departed, during which time he promised her hand to Felix. Felix stayed with them, enjoying Safi's tender affection. They communicated through an interpreter and shared the silent understandings through looks. Safi sang the haunting melodies of her homeland to Felix. The Turk permitted this intimacy, encouraging the young lover's hopes while secretly harboring other plans. He detested the idea of his daughter marrying a Christian, but feared Felix's wrath if he seemed reluctant, knowing he was still in Felix's debt. He schemed to keep up the pretense until he could escape with his daughter. His plans were hurried along by news from Paris. The French government was furious over the escape and relentlessly pursued Felix's involvement. Felix's scheme was soon uncovered, and Delacy and Agatha were imprisoned. The news shattered Felix's blissful illusion. The thought of his blind, aged father and gentle sister rotting in a dungeon while he enjoyed freedom and love was torment. He arranged that if the Turk found a chance to flee before he could return to Italy, Safi would stay at a convent in Leghorn. Then, leaving his beloved Arabian behind, Felix rushed to Paris, surrendering to the authorities, hoping to secure Delacy and Agatha's release. He failed. Delacy and Agatha remained imprisoned for 5 months before their trial. The verdict stripped them of their fortune and sentenced them to perpetual exile from their homeland. They found a wretched refuge in the German cottage where I discovered them. Felix soon learned that the deceitful Turk, seeing his savior plunged into poverty and ruin, betrayed any sense of gratitude. He left Italy with his daughter, insultingly sending Felix a meager sum of money, supposedly to aid him in some future endeavor. Such were the events that gnawed at Felix's heart, making him the most wretched member of his family when I first laid eyes on him. Poverty he could have borne with a proud defiance, especially if it was the price of his virtue, but the Turk's treachery and the loss of his beloved Safi, those were wounds that festered deep and refused to heal. The arrival of the Arabian princess brought a flicker of light back into his soul. When news hit Leghorn that Felix had been stripped of his wealth and status, the merchant, Safi's father, ordered her to forget her lover and prepare to return to their homeland. Safi's generous spirit revolted against this command. She tried to reason with her father, but he stormed out, leaving her with the bitter sting of his tyranny. A few days later, the Turk burst into her room with a hurried whisper of imminent danger. He believed their location in Leghorn had been compromised and that he would soon be handed over to the French authorities. He had secured a ship bound for Constantinople, intending to leave within hours. His plan was to leave Saifi behind with a trusted servant, to follow later with the bulk of their wealth, which had not yet reached Leghorn. Left alone, Safi weighed her options. The thought of living in Turkey repelled her. Her religion and her liberated spirit were in complete opposition to it. While rummaging through her father's papers, she discovered Felix's place of exile and the name of the village where he was hiding. After a period of hesitation, she made her decision. Gathering her jewels and a sum of money, she left Italy with an attendant, a native of Leghorn, who spoke the common language of Turkey, and set off for Germany. They made it to a town about 20 miles from De Lacy's cottage when misfortune struck. Her attendant fell dangerously ill. Safi, with unwavering devotion, tended to her, but the girl succumbed to her illness, leaving Saifi alone in a foreign land, unfamiliar with the language and customs. Despite her dire circumstances, Saifi's luck turned. The Italian servant had mentioned their destination to the locals. After her attendant's death, the kindly woman who had sheltered them took it upon herself to ensure Saifi's safe passage to Felix's cottage. Thus, against a backdrop of fear and uncertainty, Saifi found herself at the doorstep of her lover, rekindling hope and life in a heart battered by despair. Chapter 14. Such was the story of My Beloved Cottagers, a tale that carved itself into the deepest recesses of my mind. It revealed a world of human virtues and vices, pushing me to admire the former and detest the latter. Crime to me was still a distant shadow. Benevolence and generosity, however, stood clear and present, urging me to join the vibrant play of life where such admirable qualities shone. But I must tell you about an incident in early August that changed everything. One night, during my usual foray into the nearby woods to gather food and firewood for my protectors, I stumbled upon a leather portmanteau. Inside were clothes and several books. I eagerly seized my treasure and hurried back to my hideout. The books, luckily, were written in the language I had been learning from the cottagers. They were Paradise Lost, a volume of Plutarch's Lives, and The Sorrows of Werther. These treasures filled me with an uncontainable joy. I pored over them constantly, while my friends went about their daily routines. I can hardly describe the impact these books had on me. They conjured a whirlwind of new images and feelings, lifting me to ecstatic heights, only to plunge me into the depths of despair. The Sorrows of Werther, with its simple yet affecting story, opened my eyes to a myriad of opinions and subjects previously unknown to me. It mirrored the gentle and domestic manners I had observed among my protectors, coupled with lofty sentiments and feelings that transcended mere self-interest. Werther himself seemed a being of divine depth, his musings on death and suicide filling me with awe. Though I didn't fully grasp his struggles, I wept for his demise, sensing its profound sadness. As I read, I found myself relating deeply, yet feeling alien to the characters and conversations. I sympathized with them, yet I was an outsider, formless, dependent on none, connected to no one. The path of my departure was free, and no one would mourn my end. My hideous appearance and towering stature only deepened my existential crisis. What was I? Where did I come from? Where was I destined to go? These questions haunted me, unanswered. Plutarch's Lives had a different effect. While Werther brought despondency and gloom, Plutarch elevated my thoughts, steering me away from my own wretched existence to admire the heroes of old. Many tales surpassed my understanding, painting vast kingdoms, mighty rivers, and endless seas, concepts far removed from my secluded life. Yet these stories ignited a burning passion for virtue and an abhorrence for vice. Peaceful lawgivers like Numa and Solon became my idols, contrasting sharply with my admiration for the violent conquests of Romulus and Theseus. The simple patriarchal lives of my protectors reinforced these impressions, but Paradise Lost evoked even deeper emotions. I read it as a true history, its depiction of an omnipotent god clashing with his creations, stirring awe and terror. I often saw parallels to my own life. Like Adam, I was unique, linked to no other being. Yet, unlike Adam, I emerged from chaos, wretched, helpless, and alone. Many times I felt closer to Satan, envying the bliss of my protectors, feeling the bitter sting of exclusion. One day I found the papers in the pocket of the clothes I had taken from your lab. These were your journal entries from the months before my creation, detailing every step of your grotesque experiment. As I read, I was overcome with nausea. Hateful day when I received life, I cried. Accursed Creator, why did you make me so hideous that even you turned away in disgust? God made man in his own image, beautiful and alluring, but my form is a vile parody of yours. Satan had companions, fellow demons to share his misery. I was utterly alone. Despite my despair, I clung to hope. I believed that if the cottagers knew of my admiration for their virtues, they would show me compassion. I postponed revealing myself, wanting to learn more and improve my chances of acceptance. Meanwhile, the arrival of Safi brought joy and prosperity to the cottage. Felix and Agatha spent more time in leisure, assisted by servants, while I watched, yearning for their affection. As winter approached, my resolve grew stronger. I planned to introduce myself to De Lacy when he was alone, hoping his blindness would shield him from my monstrous appearance. One day, when the others left for a walk, I seized my chance. The old man played mournful tunes on his guitar, his face first lit with joy, then clouded with sadness. Finally, he set the instrument aside and sank into deep thought. This was my moment to step out of the shadows and into the light, to seek the compassion I so desperately craved. My heart thudded like a drum roll in a horror movie crescendo. This was it, the moment that would either fulfill my deepest hopes or shatter them completely. The cottage was eerily silent, the servants having left for a nearby fair. It was the perfect opportunity. Yet, as I approached the door, my courage faltered and I crumpled to the ground. Gathering myself, I rose again, determined, and moved the planks concealing my hovel. The cool air hit me like a splash of water, reviving my resolve. I approached the door and knocked. "Who's there?" The voice was weary but inviting. "Come in." I stepped inside. "Pardon this intrusion," I said. "I'm a traveler seeking a bit of rest. Could you spare a moment of warmth and a place by your fire?" "Enter," said De Lacy. "I will try to help, but my children are away and I am blind. I may find it difficult to offer you much." "Please don't trouble yourself," I replied. "I have food. I only seek warmth and a bit of rest." I settled by the fire, silence wrapping around us like a heavy fog. Time was ticking away, but my mind raced, unsure how to begin. Then the old man spoke. "By your accent, stranger, I assume you are French, are you?" "No," I answered, "but I was educated by a French family and know only that language. I am seeking the protection of some dear friends, although they have never met me. I am full of fears, for if they reject me, I am alone in this world." "Do not despair," he said. "To be friendless is unfortunate, but men's hearts are full of brotherly love and charity, unprejudiced by self-interest. If your friends are as good as you believe, do not give up hope. They are kind, the best people in the world, but they are prejudiced against me. Despite my good intentions and harmless life, a cloud of prejudice obscures their view of me. They see not a friend, but a monster. That is indeed unfortunate, but if you are truly innocent, can you not prove them wrong? I am trying to, but the fear of rejection terrifies me. I love these people deeply and have secretly helped them for months. They think I mean them harm. This is the prejudice I must overcome." "Where do these friends reside?" "Nearby," I said. The old man paused, then offered, "If you trust me with your story, perhaps I can help. I am blind, so I cannot judge your appearance, but your words sound sincere. I am poor and an exile, but I would be glad to help." "Thank you, kind sir," I said, feeling a glimmer of hope. "Your generosity lifts me. With your help, I might find acceptance among your fellow men." "Heaven forbid you should be cast out, even if you had sinned." "Desperation leads not to virtue. I too have suffered, condemned though innocent. I understand your plight." "How can I thank you? Yours is the first voice of kindness I have heard. Your compassion gives me hope that I may succeed with my friends." "May I know the names and residence of these friends?" I hesitated. This was the moment of truth. My resolve crumbled, and I sank into a chair, sobbing. Just then, I heard the footsteps outside. In desperation, I seized the old man's hand. "Now is the time. Save me. You and your family are the friends I seek. Do not abandon me now." "Great God!" the old man exclaimed. "Who are you?" At that instant, the door burst open, and Felix, Safi, and Agatha entered. Their reactions were of sheer horror. Agatha fainted, and Safi, panic-stricken, fled the cottage. Felix, with a strength fueled by terror and fury, tore me from his father's grasp and threw me to the ground, striking me with a stick. I could have torn him apart, but a wave of bitter sickness and despair washed over me, staying my hand. As Felix readied for another blow, I stumbled from the cottage, retreating to the dark solace of my hovel, unnoticed in the chaos. Chapter 15. Cursed, cursed Creator, why did you give me life? Why, in that hellish moment, didn't I snuff out this miserable spark you so carelessly bestowed? Despair hadn't fully gripped me yet. I was consumed by rage and a thirst for revenge. I could have torched that cottage and its oblivious occupants, relishing in their screams and agony. When night fell, I left my hideout and wandered the woods, no longer afraid of being seen. I howled my anguish into the night like some wild beast, tearing through the underbrush with a manic fury. The cold stars mocked me from above, and the skeletal trees waved their branches as if in laughter. Occasionally, the sweet song of a night bird would pierce the stillness, mocking my torment. Everyone else slept or reveled in their joy. I was alone, a hell within me, yearning to rip up the trees, spread chaos, and then bask in the ruin I had wrought. But even this frenzy couldn't last. Exhaustion overtook me, and I collapsed onto the damp ground, drowning in despair. Who among the millions of humans would pity or help me? None. Why should I show kindness to my enemies? No, from that moment I vowed eternal war against mankind, especially against my accursed Creator who had doomed me to this torment. As the sun rose, I heard the voices of men and knew I couldn't return to my retreat. I hid in the underbrush, dedicating the day to reflection. The warm sunshine and fresh air calmed me somewhat, and I reconsidered the events at the cottage. Perhaps I had been too hasty. The old man had shown interest in my plight, and I was foolish to expose myself to his children. I should have earned de Lacy's trust gradually, then revealed myself to his family. My errors weren't irreparable. After much thought, I decided to return to the cottage and seek out the old man. Maybe, with his help, I could win over the others. These thoughts soothed me, and I fell into a restless sleep, plagued by nightmares of the previous day. I woke exhausted and, realizing it was night, set out to find food. Once sated, I headed back to the familiar path leading to the cottage. All was quiet. I slipped into my hovel and waited for the family to awaken. But the hours passed, and the sun climbed high without any sign of them. Panic gripped me. The cottage was dark and silent. Two countrymen passed by and spoke animatedly, but I couldn't understand their language. Soon, Felix approached with another man. I was puzzled. He hadn't left the cottage that morning. I strained to hear their conversation. "Do you realize," said Felix's companion, "you'll owe 3 months' rent and lose your garden's produce? I don't want to take advantage. Take a few days to reconsider." "It's useless," Felix replied, trembling. "We can never return. My father's life is at risk after the terrible event I told you about. My wife and sister will never recover. Please, take the cottage. Let us leave." Felix and the man entered the cottage briefly, then left. I never saw the de Lacy family again. I stayed in my hovel, engulfed in despair. My protectors had abandoned me, severing my last tie to the world. For the first time, hatred and a thirst for revenge filled my heart, and I welcomed them. I envisioned injury and death. When I thought of the kind de Lacy, gentle Agatha, and beautiful Safi, I wept. But their rejection reignited my rage. Unable to harm any human, I turned my fury on inanimate objects. As night fell, I surrounded the cottage with combustibles. After destroying the garden, I waited impatiently for the moon to set, ready to unleash my vengeance. As the night deepened, a fierce wind howled through the woods, scattering the lingering clouds like a frenzied conductor dispersing an unruly orchestra. The blast, wild and unrelenting, triggered a madness in me, pushing my sanity to its breaking point. I grabbed a dry branch, lit it, and danced maniacally around the cursed cottage, eyes fixed on the western horizon where the moon flirted with the edge. As its orb dipped, I raised my flaming brand high. With a primal scream, I ignited the straw, heather, and brush I'd gathered. The wind fueled the flames, wrapping the cottage in a deadly embrace, its fiery tongues licking the structure with a ravenous hunger. Once I was sure nothing could save the cottage, I retreated to the woods, seeking refuge among the shadows. The world stretched out before me in its vast, indifferent expanse. Where could I go? Everywhere. I was hated and feared. Then the thought of you, my creator, crossed my mind. I had learned from your notes that you were my maker. Geneva, you mentioned, was your hometown. I resolved to find you there. But how would I navigate? I knew I had to travel southwest, guided only by the sun. I couldn't ask for directions, I couldn't risk encountering another human. Yet I clung to the hope that you, the source of my misery, might offer some form of solace, even though I loathed you. You, who had cursed me with consciousness, and then cast me into a world that despised me. My journey was grueling and my suffering relentless. I left the district late in autumn, traveling only by night to avoid human eyes. Nature decayed around me, the sun grew cold, and the earth became a barren wasteland. Mighty rivers froze over, and I found no shelter. I cursed the very ground I walked on. my once gentle nature had turned to bitterness and gall. The closer I got to Geneva, the more my desire for revenge burned within me. Despite the snow and ice, I pushed on, my rage sustaining me. Occasionally, I found clues to guide me, but often I wandered off course, lost in my agony. One spring morning, lulled by the pleasant weather, I dared to travel by daylight through a dense forest. The warmth and beauty stirred something within me, a long-forgotten sense of gentleness. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel happiness. Tears of gratitude streamed down my cheeks as I gazed up at the sun. As I wandered, I reached a riverbank where trees dipped their budding branches into the rushing water. Unsure of which path to take, I heard voices and hid beneath a cypress. A young girl, laughing, ran towards me. She slipped and fell into the river. Without thinking, I leaped from my hiding place and saved her from the current, dragging her to the shore. She was unconscious, and I tried desperately to revive her. Suddenly, a man burst from the trees, likely the one she had been playing with. Seeing me, he tore the girl from my arms and fled. I followed, driven by an instinct I didn't fully understand. The man, seeing me approach, aimed a gun and fired. I fell, writhing in pain as he disappeared into the forest. This was my reward for saving a human life, a bullet wound shattering my flesh and bone. The kindness I had felt moments before turned to a seething hatred. Inflamed by pain, I vowed eternal vengeance on all mankind, but the agony was too much. My pulse slowed and I lost consciousness, consumed by my suffering. Weeks passed in the desolate woods, trying to heal the bullet wound in my shoulder. I had no idea if the bullet was still lodged inside or had passed through, but without tools or help, I was left to my own devices. The physical pain was relentless, but it was the emotional torment of betrayal and injustice that truly gnawed at me. Each day, my mind churned with thoughts of revenge, dark and deadly, promising retribution for the agony I had endured. Finally, my wound began to heal and I pressed on with my journey. But spring's bright sun and gentle breezes no longer brought me solace. They only mocked my misery, a cruel reminder that joy was a luxury I could never grasp. As my journey neared its end, I found myself on the outskirts of Geneva. It was evening when I arrived, and I sought refuge in a secluded spot among the fields to gather my thoughts. Exhaustion and hunger gnawed at me, and I was too consumed by sorrow to appreciate the serene evening or the sun setting behind the Jura Mountains. A brief, restless sleep was interrupted by the playful approach of a beautiful child, his laughter piercing my bleak reverie. An idea seized me. This innocent creature was too young to fear my deformity. If I could seize him, raise him as my companion, perhaps I wouldn't be so alone in this world. Driven by this desperate hope, I grabbed the boy as he passed. His scream was piercing, and he struggled violently against me. "Let me go, you monster! You want to eat me!" he cried, his small fists pounding uselessly against my chest. "Calm down, child. I won't harm you," I said, trying to soothe him. But he only screamed louder. "My papa is Monsieur Frankenstein. He'll punish you." The name Frankenstein struck me like a bolt of lightning. "So you belong to my enemy," I snarled. "You shall be my first victim." His struggles intensified, and in my rage I grasped his throat to silence him. Moments later, he lay dead at my feet. Gazing at the lifeless body, a twisted sense of triumph surged through me. "I can create desolation too," I muttered, clapping my hands in glee. This death would bring anguish to Frankenstein, and I reveled in the thought of his misery. As I looked at the boy, something glittered on his chest. It was a portrait of a stunning woman. Despite my rage, her beauty captivated me for a moment. But then reality crashed back in. I would never know such beauty, never experience love. My reflection would only inspire horror in those delicate features. Enraged, I left the scene, seeking a more hidden refuge. I found a barn that appeared abandoned. Inside, a young woman slept on a bed of straw. She wasn't as beautiful as the woman in the portrait, but her youth and health made her seem radiant. Here was another person whose joy was denied to me. Leaning over her, I whispered, "Awake, fair maiden. Your lover is near, one who would give his life for your affection." She stirred, and a thrill of terror shot through me. If she awoke and saw me, she would scream and curse me as a murderer. The thought drove me mad with anger. She was the reason for my crime. She should pay for it. I slipped the portrait into her dress and fled. For days, I haunted the area, torn between wanting to confront you and the desire to leave the world behind. Eventually, I wandered into the mountains, consumed by a burning rage only you could quench. We would not part until you agreed to my demand. I was alone, miserable, shunned by humanity. But if you created a companion, one as hideous as me, she wouldn't reject me. This creature you must create. Chapter 16. The creature finished speaking, his gaze piercing through me, expecting an answer. My mind was a whirlwind, struggling to grasp the enormity of his request. He continued, his voice a mix of desperation and command. "You must create a female for me, someone who can share my existence. Only you can do this, and I demand it as my right. You must not refuse." His tale of a peaceful life among the cottagers had momentarily calmed my anger, but his demand reignited the fury within me. "I refuse," I spat. "No torture will ever make me consent. You may make me miserable, but you will never make me a coward. Shall I create another like you to spread havoc across the world? Begone. I have answered you. You can torture me, but I will never consent." "You are wrong," the creature replied, his tone chillingly calm. "Instead of threats, I will reason with you. I am malicious because I am miserable. Am I not shunned and hated by all mankind? You, my creator, would tear me to pieces and celebrate. Why should I pity man when he shows no pity for me? You would not call it murder if you threw me into an ice crevasse and ended my existence. Shall I respect humanity when it treats me with contempt? Let them live with me in kindness, and I will repay them with gratitude. But that will never happen. Human senses are insurmountable barriers. I will have my revenge. If I cannot inspire love, I will cause fear, especially in you, my creator. Beware, I will destroy you and all you hold dear until you curse the day of your birth." His face contorted into a mask of rage, too hideous for human eyes, but he soon regained his composure. "I intended to reason. This passion does me no good, but you are the cause. If anyone showed me kindness, I would return it 100-fold. For one creature's sake, I would make peace with the world. What I ask is reasonable. Create a female as hideous as myself. Our lives will not be happy, but they will be harmless. Make me happy. Let me feel gratitude towards you for once. Do not deny my request." I shuddered, thinking of the consequences, but there was a twisted justice in his argument. His story and emotions showed he had feelings, and as his maker, I owed him whatever happiness I could grant. Seeing my hesitation, he pressed on. "If you consent, you and humanity will never see us again. We will go to the vast wilds of South America. We need little to survive. Acorns and berries suffice. My companion will share my nature and be content with the same. Our life will be peaceful and secluded. You must see that denying this would be an act of cruelty. I see compassion in your eyes. Let me seize this moment and persuade you. You propose to flee to the wilderness, I replied, but you crave human sympathy. How can you persevere in such exile? You will return, seeking kindness, and meet only hatred. Your evil passions will revive, and with a companion you will wreak more destruction. I cannot consent. How inconstant you are! Moments ago you were moved by my words. Now you harden your heart again. I swear, by the earth and by you who made me, that with a companion I will leave humanity forever. My evil passions will flee with sympathy. My life will be peaceful, and in death I will not curse my Creator. His words had a strange effect. I pitied him and wished to console him, but his appearance repulsed me. His form, a grotesque reminder of my work, filled me with horror and hatred. Yet I knew denying him a small measure of happiness was wrong. Very well, I said, I will consider your request. The creature's tale had ended, leaving me tangled in a web of horror and uncertainty. He stared at me, waiting for my answer. My mind was a maelstrom, struggling to comprehend the full weight of his demand. You swear to be harmless, I said, but haven't you already shown such malice that I should distrust you? Could this be another ploy to widen your scope for revenge? Don't trifle with me, he retorted, his tone sharp and dangerous. If I have no ties and no affections, hatred and vice are my only companions. The love of another will quell my crimes, and I shall become a ghost, unseen and unknown. My vices are born of this cursed solitude I detest. My virtues will bloom when I have a companion. I will feel the affections of a sensitive being and be part of the world I am now excluded from. I paused, contemplating his words and the rage simmering beneath them. His tale had revealed glimpses of potential goodness, crushed by rejection and scorn. His power and threats weighed heavily in my mind. A creature who could endure the harshest environments, eluding capture among glaciers and precipices, was not to be underestimated. After long reflection, I concluded that justice demanded I comply with his request. I consent, I said, my voice steady, but you must swear to leave Europe and every place inhabited by man as soon as I deliver your companion. I swear, he cried, his eyes burning with a strange mix of hope and anguish. By the sun, the sky, and the fire of love in my heart, grant my prayer, and you shall never see me again. Return home and begin your work. I will watch with unutterable anxiety. When you are ready, I will appear. With that, he vanished, descending the mountain with inhuman speed, disappearing into the undulating ice. His tale had consumed the entire day, and the sun was dipping below the horizon. I needed to descend to the valley quickly, but my heart was heavy and my steps were slow. Navigating the narrow mountain paths in the encroaching darkness was a daunting task. The physical effort distracted me from the emotional turmoil of the day's events. Night had fully set in by the time I reached the halfway point and collapsed beside a fountain. The stars flickered intermittently through drifting clouds, and the dark pines loomed like sentinels. The scene was hauntingly solemn, stirring strange, dark thoughts within me. I wept bitterly, clasping my hands in despair. O stars, clouds, and winds, mock me no more. If you pity me, crush my sensations and memories. Let me be nothing. If not, leave me in darkness. Such wild, miserable thoughts tormented me. The eternal twinkling of the stars and the sinister howling of the wind weighed on me like a curse. Morning found me still restless as I arrived in Chamonix. Without stopping, I made my way back to Geneva. My heart was a leaden weight, my mind a storm. I could not articulate my sensations. They crushed me with their intensity. I arrived home haggard and wild. My appearance alarmed my family, but I offered no explanations. I felt like an outcast, unworthy of their sympathy, as if I had forfeited the right to their companionship. Yet I adored them and resolved to save them, dedicating myself to the most abhorred task. The thought of this work eclipsed everything else, making it the sole reality in my fragmented life. Chapter 17. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, as I trudged back to Geneva, the weight of my unfulfilled promise gnawing at my soul like a parasite. The creature's demand haunted me, yet my revulsion for the task paralyzed any attempt to begin. Crafting a female counterpart wasn't just a matter of stitching flesh and bone, it required months of intense study and meticulous experimentation. I'd heard the whispers of breakthroughs by an English scientist that might aid me, but I clung to every excuse to delay, shrinking from the first step down that dark path. Remarkably, as the dread of my promise lingered, my health began to recover. The suffocating melancholy that had enveloped me lifted slightly, bringing fleeting moments of peace. My father noticed and, in his joy, sought ways to dispel the shadows that still occasionally clouded my mind. During these spells, I'd retreat into the perfect solitude of Lake Geneva, spending whole days adrift in a small boat, losing myself in the rhythmic lapping of the waves and the shifting clouds. The fresh air and sunlight were a balm, and I'd return to the house with a semblance of cheer. One evening, after such a retreat, my father took me aside. "Victor, I see glimpses of the old you, but you're still troubled. I've been racking my brain for the cause and think I may have found it. Tell me, son, is it your reluctance to marry Elizabeth that torments you?" His words struck me like a blow. "My dear father, you misunderstand. I love Elizabeth dearly. My future is bound up in our union." His face lit up with relief. "That's a great comfort to me. If you feel this way, then let us dispel this gloom. Let's proceed with the marriage immediately. We've faced much sorrow, and perhaps this joy can restore us." I stood silent, a maelstrom of thoughts whirling in my mind. The prospect of marrying Elizabeth while under the shadow of my unfulfilled promise was horrifying. I couldn't face such a celebration with this grim task looming over me. I had to complete it, let the monster take his mate, and only then could I hope for peace. Moreover, I needed to travel to England to gain the necessary knowledge for my work. Correspondence would be too slow and uncertain. The idea of conducting my abhorrent experiments under my family's roof was intolerable. The risk of discovery was too great. I needed solitude and distance. Finally, I spoke. "Father, I wish to travel to England. I believe it will be beneficial for my studies and my recovery." He looked puzzled but willing. "If you believe it's necessary, then go. Perhaps the journey will do you good." The duration of my absence was left to my discretion, but my father, ever the considerate planner, had arranged for Clerval to join me at Strasbourg. Though I craved solitude, I welcomed Henry's company to fend off the dark thoughts that plagued me. Together, we embarked on the journey with the understanding that my marriage to Elizabeth would follow my return. As we set off for England, I clung to the hope that this journey would restore my sanity. The promise of freedom from my dreadful obligation and the prospect of a future with Elizabeth were the beacons guiding me through the oppressive gloom. Only by fulfilling my monstrous task could I hope to reclaim the fragments of a life shattered by ambition and its horrific consequences. Days melted into weeks, weeks into months, as I slogged back to Geneva. The creature's demand hung over me like a guillotine blade, poised and ready to drop. The mere thought of crafting a female counterpart made my skin crawl. This wasn't just a project of flesh and bone, it required months of obsessive study and painstaking experimentation. Rumors of breakthroughs by an English scientist teased at the edges of my mind, but I latched onto every excuse to delay. Each step toward that dark path felt like walking into my own grave. Oddly, as the dread of my promise lingered, my health began to improve. The crushing melancholy that had weighed me down started to lift, bringing rare moments of calm. My father noticed and, in his joy, sought ways to chase away the shadows that still clung to me. During these spells, I'd escape to the serene solitude of Lake Geneva, spending entire days adrift in a small boat, hypnotized by the gentle waves and drifting clouds. The fresh air and sunlight were a balm, and I'd return home with a hint of cheer. One evening, after one of these retreats, my father pulled me aside. "Victor, I see flashes of the old you, but something still troubles you. I think I've figured it out. Tell me, son, is it your reluctance to marry Elizabeth that's eating at you?" His words hit me like a freight train. "Father, you've got it all wrong. I love Elizabeth with all my heart. My future hinges on our union." Relief washed over his face. "That's wonderful to hear. If that's true, let's not wait any longer. Let's go ahead with the marriage. We've endured so much sorrow. Perhaps this joy can bring us back to life." I stood there, my mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. The idea of marrying Elizabeth while this horrific task loomed over me was terrifying. How could I celebrate with this monstrous obligation hanging over my head? I had to complete it, let the creature take his mate, and only then could I hope for peace. Moreover, I needed to travel to England to gain the knowledge required for my work. Correspondence would be too slow, too uncertain. The idea of conducting my grim experiments under my family's roof was unthinkable. The risk of discovery was too high. I needed solitude and distance. Finally, I spoke. "Father, I need to travel to England. It's essential for my studies and my recovery." He looked puzzled, but agreed. "If you believe it's necessary, then go. Perhaps the journey will be good for you." The duration of my absence was left to my discretion, but my father, ever the thoughtful planner, had arranged for Clerval to join me in Strasbourg. Though I craved solitude, I welcomed Henry's company to fend off the dark thoughts that plagued me. Together, we embarked on the journey with the understanding that my marriage to Elizabeth would follow my return. As we set off for England, I clung to the hope that this journey would restore my sanity. The promise of freedom from my dreadful obligation and the prospect of a future with Elizabeth were the beacons guiding me through the oppressive gloom. Only by fulfilling my monstrous task could I hope to reclaim the shattered fragments of a life marred by ambition and its horrific consequences. Chapter 18. London was our current pit stop, a city buzzing with history and eccentricity. Clerval was in his element, soaking up the vibes from the intellectual elite of the time. For him, it was a golden opportunity to rub elbows with geniuses, but for me, the city's allure was overshadowed by a dark mission. The only people I cared to meet were the natural philosophers who could help me fulfill the promise I dreaded. In another life, this journey might have thrilled me, but now my existence felt cursed. I visited these scholars not out of interest but necessity, driven by a morbid goal. Socializing was a chore, a constant reminder of my isolation. Alone, I could find a fleeting peace in nature's beauty. Henry's companionship was a balm, but crowds and their idle chatter brought back the suffocating despair. The memories of William and Justine haunted me, a blood-stained barrier between me and humanity. Clerval, ever the optimist, was my tether to a past life. His curiosity and zest for knowledge mirrored the person I used to be. Observing the diverse customs and cultures fascinated him. He had a grand plan to visit India, believing his linguistic skills and cultural insights could bridge gaps and enhance European trade. Only in Britain could he lay the groundwork for his ambitious project. Busy and enthusiastic, he was the polar opposite of my brooding self. I masked my inner turmoil to avoid dampening his spirits, often feigning other engagements to be alone with my grim thoughts. During my solitary hours, I gathered materials for the dreaded creation. Each step was torturous, like the relentless drip of water torture. The very thought of it sent waves of anguish through me. Every reference to the task made my heart pound and my lips tremble. After several months in London, we received an unexpected letter from an old acquaintance in Scotland. He extolled the natural beauty of his homeland and invited us to visit. Clerval was eager, and I, desperate for an escape, found the idea of retreating to nature's embrace appealing. We had arrived in England in October, and it was now February. We decided to start our journey north in a month's time. Instead of taking the main route to Edinburgh, we planned a scenic detour through Windsor, Oxford, Matlock, and the Cumberland Lakes, aiming to complete our tour by the end of July. I packed my chemical instruments and the materials I had painstakingly collected, intending to finalize my work in a secluded corner of the Scottish Highlands. We left London on March 27th, spending a few days exploring Windsor's enchanting forest. The ancient oaks, abundant wildlife, and graceful deer were a delightful change for us mountaineers. Next, we headed to Oxford. As we entered the city, we were enveloped by the weight of its historical significance. It was here that Charles Arty had rallied his forces, where loyalty had persisted even as the nation turned against him. The memory of the tragic king and his loyal companions lent a poignant charm to every corner of the city. We imagined their spirits lingering in the ancient streets and majestic colleges. Even without this historical allure, the city's beauty was undeniable. The grand architecture, sprawling meadows, and the serene Isis River, reflecting towers and spires nestled among ancient trees, captivated us. Oxford's timeless elegance and profound history stirred something deep within me, momentarily lifting the oppressive gloom. Yet I knew that beyond these fleeting moments of peace, the shadow of my unfulfilled promise loomed, an ever-present spectre urging me toward an uncertain and dreadful future. I soaked in the scene before me, but it was bittersweet, shadowed by memories of the past and fears of the future. I used to be content, easily captivated by the beauty of nature and the marvels of human creation. But now I was a withered tree, struck by lightning, forever scarred. I felt like a tragic figure, destined to live on as a miserable relic of what once was. Oxford held us in its thrall for a while. We wandered through its storied streets, trying to touch the echoes of its historical past. We visited the tomb of Hampden and the field where he fell. For a moment, I felt a flicker of inspiration, imagining the ideals of liberty and sacrifice, but my personal demons quickly dragged me back into darkness. We left Oxford reluctantly and moved on to Matlock. The countryside there reminded me of Switzerland, though its hills lacked the towering grandeur of the Alps. We explored caves and cabinets of curiosities, but the mention of Chamonix by Henry sent chills down my spine. I couldn't wait to leave Matlock behind. From Derby, we continued north, spending 2 months in the breathtaking landscapes of Cumberland and Westmoreland. The snowy patches on the mountains, the serene lakes, and the rushing streams were familiar, almost comforting. Here, we met people who nearly tricked me into feeling happy. Clerval thrived in this environment, his mind expanding in the company of talented individuals. He found a new appreciation for his own potential and even mused about living here permanently, hardly missing Switzerland and the Rhine. But the life of a traveler isn't all roses. It's a constant stretch, a roller coaster of emotions. Just when you start to settle in and find joy, you're pulled away to the next destination, forced to leave behind newfound pleasures for fresh experiences. As we neared the end of our stay in Cumberland, our appointment with our Scottish friend loomed. We left behind the lakes and the people we'd grown fond of, and I was not sorry to go. The promise I'd made to the creature weighed heavily on me. I feared his wrath if I failed. The thought of him lurking in Switzerland, threatening my loved ones, haunted me. I awaited letters from home with dread, terrified of what news they might bring. Every delay in the mail filled me with dread, and even when letters arrived, the sight of Elizabeth or my father's handwriting made my heart pound with fear. I imagined the creature might follow me and take out his anger on Henry. When these thoughts consumed me, I stayed close to Henry, shadowing his every move to protect him from the monster's imagined rage. I felt like a criminal, burdened by a curse as deadly as any sin. We reached Edinburgh, a city that should have captivated me with its charm. Clerval preferred Oxford, but he found solace in Edinburgh's new town, its romantic castle, and the beautiful surroundings. Yet I remained impatient, eager to reach the end of my journey. We left Edinburgh and travelled through Cupar, St Andrew AS, and along the banks of the Tay to Perth, where our friend awaited us. But I was in no mood for socializing or engaging with strangers. I told Clerval I needed to explore Scotland alone. "Enjoy yourself," I said, "but let this be our rendezvous. I may be gone a month or two. Please leave me to my peace and solitude. When I return, I hope to have a lighter heart." Henry tried to dissuade me, but eventually relented, asking only that I write often. "I'd rather be with you," he said, "in your solitary rambles than with these strangers. Hurry back, my friend, so I can feel at home again." So I set off alone, haunted by the past, fearful of the future, yet driven by a desperate hope that the solitude and the journey might offer some respite from my inner turmoil. Parting ways with Henry, I resolved to seek out a remote corner of Scotland, a place so desolate it could swallow my grim task whole. The monster, my ever-present shadow, would surely find me when the grotesque work was done. The Northern Highlands beckoned, but it was one of the Orkney Islands, bleak and battered by relentless waves, that I chose as my grim workshop. The island was scarcely more than a jagged rock, its steep cliffs perpetually lashed by the sea. The soil was a barren curse, yielding barely enough to sustain a few scrawny cows and provide oatmeal for its skeletal inhabitants. Only 5 souls lived there, their gaunt forms a testament to their meager sustenance. Vegetables, bread, even fresh water had to be ferried from the mainland 5 miles away. There were 3 dilapidated huts on the island, and one was vacant when I arrived. I rented it. The hut had 2 rooms, both reeking of abject poverty. The thatched roof sagged, the walls were bare, and the door hung uselessly on one hinge. I ordered repairs, bought some rudimentary furniture, and settled in. My arrival would have stirred curiosity anywhere else, but here the islanders were too dulled by their own hardships to care. They barely acknowledged me, even as I provided them with food and clothes. Suffering had numbed their senses to the point of indifference. Each morning, I threw myself into my work, but as the day waned and the weather permitted, I would walk along the stony shore, listening to the waves crash and roar. The landscape was a far cry from Switzerland's vine-clad hills and serene lakes. The Swiss lakes, playful in their turbulence, were like a child's tantrum compared to the relentless fury of the ocean here. Initially, I managed to balance my routine, but as my work progressed, it grew increasingly repugnant. There were days I couldn't bring myself to enter the makeshift lab, while other times I toiled ceaselessly, day and night, driven by a compulsion to finish. The process was sickening. During my first experiment, a feverish zeal had blinded me to the horrors of my actions. Now, every step was taken with a cold, clear awareness, and my heart often turned in revulsion at my own deeds. This solitary existence, combined with the monstrous task at hand, left my spirits frayed and my nerves on edge. Every shadow held the threat of my pursuer. I dreaded looking up, fearing to see his hideous form lurking nearby. I stayed close to the few humans around, terrified that isolation would invite the monster to confront me about his companion. Yet I pressed on, and my work neared completion. I looked forward to the end with a mix of hope and dread, my heart heavy with foreboding. The labor, revolting and soul-crushing, was almost done, and with it, I hoped, would come an end to this living nightmare. Chapter 19. One evening, I sat in my dimly lit laboratory. The sun had set, and the moon was just starting its ascent from the sea, casting an eerie glow. The inadequate light made it impossible to continue my work, leaving me idle and lost in thought. Should I push through the night or leave this grotesque task for tomorrow? My mind spiraled back 3 years to when I first played God and unleashed a fiend upon the world. That abomination had ripped apart my soul, leaving behind a legacy of unimaginable horror. Now, here I was, poised to create another being, equally unknown and potentially even more monstrous. What if she turned out worse than her mate, reveling in bloodshed for her own twisted pleasure? He had promised to hide away from mankind, but she hadn't. What if she refused to abide by any agreements made before her creation? They might loathe each other. The creature already despised his own deformity. Seeing it reflected in a female form might drive him to new depths of hatred. Or worse, she could reject him for the beauty of humanity, leaving him alone again, but now with a burning rage stoked by abandonment. Even if they fled to some desolate corner of the earth, they would inevitably breed, spawning a new race of horrors. Could I justify bringing such a curse upon future generations? The enormity of my promise struck me hard for the first time. I trembled, imagining future generations cursing my name for their suffering. I was lost in these dark thoughts when a movement caught my eye. By the light of the moon, I saw him, the demon, watching me with a ghastly grin. He had trailed me through forests, hidden in caves, and now stood there, waiting to claim his prize. His face twisted with malice and treachery, and a madness gripped me. I tore apart the creature I was working on. His howl of despair and rage echoed through the night as he fled. Locking the door behind me, I vowed never to resume my monstrous labors. My steps were unsteady as I retreated to my room. Alone in the oppressive gloom, I felt the weight of my actions. Hours passed as I stared out at the nearly motionless sea, The stillness was deafening until I heard the paddling of oars near the shore. The creak of my door made my blood run cold. I was rooted in place, paralyzed by the same helplessness one feels in a nightmare. Footsteps echoed down the hall and the door swung open. There he was, the creature I had come to dread. He shut the door behind him and approached, his voice a low growl. "You've destroyed the work you began. What is your intention? Do you dare break your promise?" His words were laced with bitterness and rage. "I followed you from Switzerland, endured unimaginable hardships. Do you dare destroy my hopes?" "Begone!" I spat. "I break my promise. I will never create another like you." "Fool," he snarled, "I reasoned with you, but you've shown you're unworthy. Remember, I have power. I can make your life a living hell. You created me, but now I am your master. Obey. I won't be moved by your threats. I refuse to unleash another monster upon the world. Begone." His face contorted with fury. "Shall every man have a mate, and I remain alone? I had feelings once, met with hatred. Beware, your happiness will turn to dread. Revenge remains, dearer than light or food. I may die, but first you will curse the sun that gazes on your misery. Beware, for I am fearless and therefore powerful. I will watch with the wiliness of a snake to sting with its venom. Man, you shall repent of the injuries you inflict." His threat lingered in the air as he stormed out, leaving me to the dark realization that the true horror was only just beginning. Morning broke over a restless night. The demon's words echoed in my mind, filling me with a dreadful resolve. I left the house, the site of the previous night's confrontation, and wandered the rocky shore. The sea, with its relentless waves, felt like a barrier separating me from humanity. A twisted part of me wished to remain here, isolated, to escape the misery awaiting my return. By noon, the oppressive thoughts exhausted me, and I collapsed onto the grass, falling into a deep, troubled sleep. When I awoke, the sun was low in the sky, and my mind, though clearer, was still haunted by the fiend's promise. I gnawed on an oaten cake when a fishing boat landed nearby. A fisherman brought me a packet containing letters from Geneva and one from Clerval, urging me to join him. Clerval's letter was a lifeline, pulling me back from the brink. He was impatient to leave for London, needing my company for his Indian enterprise. His words rekindled a spark of life within me, and I decided to leave the island in 2 days. But before I could leave, there was a grim task to complete. I had to pack up my instruments, which meant returning to the room where I had destroyed the creature. At dawn, with a heavy heart, I entered the lab. The remains of the half-finished creation lay scattered, and the sight turned my stomach. I gathered the instruments and, not wanting to leave evidence of my ghastly work, placed the remains in a basket weighted with stones, planning to dump it into the sea that night. As I worked, the horror of my promise lifted. I saw clearly for the first time the atrocity I had nearly committed. The demon's threat still weighed on me, but I resolved never to create another monster. To do so would be the height of selfishness and wickedness. My path was clear. I would destroy all traces of my work and face whatever vengeance the creature might bring. I sat one evening in my cramped makeshift laboratory. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, and the moon was just beginning to rise over the ocean, casting an eerie glow across the water. With insufficient light to continue my gruesome task, I paused, torn between working through the night or giving in to the creeping exhaustion. My thoughts drifted back to 3 years ago when I first played God, creating a monster whose unparalleled savagery had scarred my soul. Now I was on the verge of crafting another being, ignorant of her potential for malevolence. What if she turned out even more monstrous than her mate, reveling in murder and chaos? He had promised to vanish, but she hadn't. A creature with her own mind might reject any agreements made before her existence. They might despise each other. The creature already loathed his deformity. How much more might he hate it when mirrored in a female form? Or worse, she could reject him for the beauty of humans, leaving him alone and enraged once more. Even if they escaped to some desolate place, they would eventually reproduce, unleashing a new race of devils. Could I really doom future generations for my own peace of mind? The full horror of my promise struck me like a sledgehammer. For the first time, I realized the true atrocity I was about to unleash. Future generations might curse me for my selfishness. I shuddered, my heart heavy with dread. Then, looking up, I saw him, the demon, watching me through the window, his lips twisted in a ghastly grin. He had followed me, hiding in forests and caves, and now stood there, waiting. His face, twisted with malice, drove me to madness. In a fit of rage, I tore apart the creature I had been working on. With a howl of despair and rage, the wretch fled into the night. Locking the door behind me, I vowed never to resume this monstrous task. My steps were unsteady as I retreated to my room, alone in the oppressive gloom, haunted by my actions. Hours passed as I stared out at the nearly motionless sea. The silence was deafening until I heard the paddling of oars near the shore. The creak of my door made my blood run cold. Rooted in place, I felt the helplessness of a nightmare. Footsteps echoed down the hall, and then the door swung open. There he was, the creature I had come to dread. He shut the door and approached, his voice a low growl. "You've destroyed the work you began. What is your intention? Do you dare break your promise?" His words were laced with bitterness and rage. "I followed you from Switzerland, endured unimaginable hardships. Do you dare destroy my hopes? Begone, I spat. I break my promise. I will never create another like you." "Fool," he snarled. "I reasoned with you, but you've shown you're unworthy. Remember, I have power. I can make your life a living hell. You created me, but now I am your master. Obey." "I won't be moved by your threats. I refuse to unleash another monster upon the world. Begone." His face contorted with fury. "Shall every man have a mate, and I remain alone? I had feelings once, met with hatred. Beware, your happiness will turn to dread. Revenge remains, dearer than light or food. I may die, but first you will curse the sun that gazes on your misery. Beware, for I am fearless and therefore powerful. I will watch with the wiliness of a snake to sting with its venom. Man, you shall repent of the injuries you inflict." His threat hung in the air as he stormed out, leaving me to the dark realization that the true horror was only just beginning. Morning broke over a restless night. The demon's words echoed in my mind, filling me with a dreadful resolve. I left the house, the site of the previous night's confrontation, and wandered the rocky shore. The sea, with its relentless waves, felt like a barrier separating me from humanity. A twisted part of me wished to remain here, isolated, to escape the misery awaiting my return. By noon, the oppressive thoughts exhausted me, and I collapsed onto the grass, falling into a deep, troubled sleep. When I awoke, the sun was low in the sky, and my mind, though clearer, was still haunted by the fiend's promise. I gnawed on an oaten cake when a fishing boat landed nearby. A fisherman brought me a packet containing letters from Geneva and one from Clerval, urging me to join him. Clerval's letter was a lifeline, pulling me back from the brink. He was impatient to leave for London, needing my company for his Indian enterprise. His words rekindled a spark of life within me, and I decided to leave the island in 2 days. But before I could leave, there was a grim task to complete. I had to pack up my instruments, which meant returning to the room where I had destroyed the creature. At dawn, with a heavy heart, I entered the lab. The remains of the half-finished creation lay scattered, and the sight turned my stomach. I gathered the instruments and, not wanting to leave evidence of my ghastly work, placed the remains in a basket weighted with stones, planning to dump it into the sea that night. As I worked, the horror of my promise lifted. I saw clearly for the first time the atrocity I had nearly committed. The demon's threat still weighed on me, but I resolved never to create another monster. To do so would be the height of selfishness and wickedness. My path was clear. I would destroy all traces of my work and face whatever vengeance the creature might bring. Danny! Between 2 and 3 in the morning, the moon finally rose, casting its pale light over the restless sea. I loaded the remains into a skiff and set sail, putting as much distance as possible between me and the shore. The solitude was eerie. The only other boats were heading back to land. I felt the weight of a dreadful crime on my soul, shuddering at the thought of encountering another living being. At one point, the clear moon was suddenly swallowed by thick clouds. Taking advantage of the darkness, I cast the basket overboard, listening to the gurgling as it sank. I sailed away, the sky growing more clouded, the air chilling with a rising northeast breeze. The cold was refreshing, almost invigorating, and I decided to linger on the water. Fixing the rudder, I stretched out at the bottom of the boat, lulled by the rhythmic murmur of the waves, until sleep claimed me. I don't know how long I slept, but when I awoke, the sun was already high and the wind had picked up, tossing the boat on tumultuous waves. Panic gripped me as I realized that the wind had driven me far from the coast. I tried to change course, but quickly saw that doing so would swamp the boat. My only option was to ride out the storm. Fear gnawed at me. I had no compass and scant knowledge of these waters. I could be swept into the Atlantic, facing starvation or drowning in the endless sea. Thirst began to torment me, a prelude to further suffering. The sky was a constant shift of clouds, and the sea seemed ready to become my grave. "Fiend," I muttered, "your task is already fulfilled." Thoughts of Elizabeth, my father, and Clerval filled me with despair, imagining them at the mercy of the monster. Hours passed in this dreadful reverie, but as the sun dipped toward the horizon, the wind mercifully died down, leaving the sea in a gentle swell. Exhausted, I saw a line of high land to the south. Relief washed over me, tears streaming down my face at the sight of salvation. Our feelings are strangely mutable. Even in misery, we cling to life. Using part of my clothing, I fashioned a makeshift sail and steered toward the shore. As I drew closer, I saw signs of cultivation and vessels near the shore, a welcome sight of civilization. Approaching a small, neat town, I steered into the harbor, my heart pounding with unexpected joy. As I docked, a crowd gathered, their expressions a mix of curiosity and suspicion. They whispered among themselves, and I overheard English accents. "My good friends," I called out, "can you tell me the name of this town and where I am?" A man with a hoarse voice stepped forward. "You'll know soon enough. This place might not be to your liking, but you won't have a say in the matter." Surprised by his rudeness, I retorted, "Surely it isn't customary for Englishmen to greet strangers so inhospitably." "I don't know about the English," he replied, "but it's the custom of the Irish to hate villains." The crowd grew larger, their faces a mix of anger and curiosity. I asked for directions to an inn, but no one responded. Then an ill-looking man approached, tapping my shoulder. "Come with me to Mr. Kerwin's to account for yourself." "Who is Mr. Kerwin? Why must I account for myself? Isn't this a free country?" "Free enough for honest folks. Mr. Kerwin's a magistrate, and you're to account for the death of a gentleman found murdered here last night." Startled, I recovered quickly. Innocent, I followed in silence, led to one of the best houses in town. Despite my fatigue and hunger, I mustered my strength, aware that any sign of weakness could be misinterpreted as guilt. Little did I expect the calamity that would soon engulf me, overshadowing all fears of ignominy or death. I must pause here. It takes all my fortitude to recall and relate the frightful events that followed. Chapter 20. I was ushered into the magistrate's office, a small, cluttered space filled with the scent of old books and pipe smoke. Mr. Kerwin, a man well past his prime, but with eyes sharp as a hawk, regarded me with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. His calm demeanor barely masked the steel beneath. He gestured to my escorts, and half a dozen men stepped forward, one of whom began to recount the night's events. The fisherman, a grizzled man with salt and pepper hair, spoke first. He described how he, his son, and his brother-in-law, Daniel Nugent, had been out fishing the previous night. Around 10, a strong northerly wind had kicked up, forcing them to head for shore. It was pitch dark, the moon hidden behind the clouds, so they landed at a secluded creek 2 miles from the harbor. The old man went ahead, carrying the fishing tackle. Suddenly, he tripped and fell over something in the sand. Under the lantern's glow, they discovered the body of a young man. Assuming he was a drowning victim, they were shocked to find his clothes dry and his body still warm, bearing no marks of violence except for finger-shaped bruises around his neck. At the mention of the strangulation marks, a chill ran down my spine. I recalled the similar fate of my brother, and my vision blurred with panic. I leaned on a nearby chair for support, feeling the magistrate's keen gaze upon me, his suspicion evident. The fisherman's son confirmed the story. Then Daniel Nugent testified. He swore that just before the old man tripped, he saw a boat with a solitary figure not far from the shore. By the faint starlight, he identified it as the same boat in which I had landed. A local woman claimed to have seen the boat an hour before the body was found, the lone rower pushing off from the very spot where the corpse later washed up. Another woman, whose cottage the fishermen had taken the body to, confirmed that it was still warm when they attempted resuscitation. Daniel had gone to town for an apothecary, but it was too late. Several other witnesses testified about my landing, agreeing that I had likely been tossed around by the strong winds before returning to shore. They speculated that I might have unknowingly brought the body from elsewhere, unaware of the exact location. Kerwin, with a discerning look, ordered me to be taken to view the body. He wanted to see my reaction, likely prompted by my visible agitation during the testimony. I followed the magistrate and several others to the inn where the body lay. As I entered the dimly lit room, a sense of foreboding gripped me. I approached the coffin, my heart pounding. The sight inside froze me in place. There, lifeless and pale, lay Henry Clerval, my dear friend, my benefactor. The room spun as I gasped for air, collapsing onto the coffin. "Henry, have my cursed actions claimed you too? How many more must suffer because of me?" The shock was too much. My body convulsed violently, and darkness claimed me. When I awoke, fever had gripped me. For 2 months, I teetered on the edge of death. My ravings were horrific, as I later learned. I confessed to being the murderer of William, Justine, and Clerval. I begged my attendants to help me destroy the fiend haunting my nightmares. Often, I felt phantom hands choking me, the monster's grip tightening as I screamed in terror. Thankfully, my delirious confessions were understood only by Mr. Kerwin, who spoke my native tongue. Yet my wild gestures and agonized cries were enough to unnerve everyone else. The fever left me a shadow of my former self, haunted and broken, with the specter of my own creation ever looming. Why did I not die? More miserable than man ever was before, why did I not sink into forgetfulness and rest? Death snatches away many blooming children, the only hopes of their doting parents. How many brides and youthful lovers have been one day in the bloom of health and hope, and the next a prey for worms and the decay of the tomb? Of what materials was I made, that I could thus resist so many shocks, which, like the turning of the wheel, continually renewed the torture? But I was doomed to live, and in 2 months found myself as awakening from a dream in a prison, stretched on a wretched bed, surrounded by jailers, turnkeys, bolts, and all the miserable apparatus of a dungeon. It was morning, I remember, when I thus awoke to understanding. I had forgotten the particulars of what had happened, and only felt as if some great misfortune had suddenly overwhelmed me. But when I looked around and saw the barred windows and the squalidness of the room in which I was, all flashed across my memory, and I groaned bitterly. This sound disturbed an old woman who was sleeping in a chair beside me. She was a hired nurse, the wife of one of the turnkeys, and her countenance expressed all those bad qualities which often characterize that class. The lines of her face were hard and rude, like that of persons accustomed to see without sympathizing in sights of misery. Her tone expressed her entire indifference. She addressed me in English, and the voice struck me as one that I had heard during my sufferings. "Are you better now, sir?" said she. I replied in the same language, with a feeble voice. "I believe I am. But if it be all true, if indeed I did not dream, I am sorry that I am still alive to feel this misery and horror." "For that matter," replied the old woman, "if you mean about the gentleman you murdered, I believe that it were better for you if you were dead, for I fancy it will go hard with you. However, that's none of my business. I am sent to nurse you and get you well. I do my duty with a safe conscience. It were well if everybody did the same." I turned with loathing from the woman who could utter so unfeeling a speech to a person just saved on the very edge of death, but I felt languid and unable to reflect on all that had passed. The whole series of my life appeared to me as a dream. I sometimes doubted if indeed it were all true, for it never presented itself to my mind with the force of reality. As the images that floated before me became more distinct, I grew feverish. A darkness pressed around me. No one was near me who soothed me with the gentle voice of love. No dear hand supported me. The physician came and prescribed medicines, and the old woman prepared them for me, but utter carelessness was visible in the first, and the expression of brutality was strongly marked in the visage of the second. Who could be interested in the fate of a murderer but the hangman who would gain his fee? These were my first reflections, but I soon learned that Mr. Kerwin had shown me extreme kindness. He had caused the best room in the prison to be prepared for me. Wretched indeed was the best, and it was he who had provided a physician and a nurse. It is true, he seldom came to see me, for although he ardently desired to relieve the sufferings of every human creature, he did not wish to be present at the agonies and miserable ravings of a murderer. He came therefore sometimes to see that I was not neglected, but his visits were short and with long intervals. One day, while I was gradually recovering, I was seated in a chair, my eyes half open and my cheeks livid, like those in death. I was overcome by gloom and misery, and often reflected I had better seek death than desire to remain in a world which to me was replete with wretchedness. At one time, I considered whether I should not declare myself guilty and suffer the penalty of the law, less innocent than poor Justine had been. Such were my thoughts when the door of my apartment was opened and Mr. Kerwin entered. His countenance expressed sympathy and compassion. He drew a chair close to mine and addressed me in French. "I fear that this place is very shocking to you. Can I do anything to make you more comfortable?" "I thank you, but all that you mention is nothing to me. On the whole earth, there is no comfort which I am capable of receiving. I know that the sympathy of a stranger can be but of little relief to one borne down, as you are by so strange a misfortune, but you will, I hope, soon quit this melancholy abode, for doubtless evidence can easily be brought to free you from the criminal charge. That is my least concern. I am, by a course of strange events, become the most miserable of mortals. Persecuted and tortured as I am and have been, can death be any evil to me? Nothing indeed could be more unfortunate and agonizing than the strange chances that have lately occurred. You were thrown, by some surprising accident, on this shore renowned for its hospitality, seized immediately and charged with murder. The first sight that was presented to your eyes was the body of your friend, murdered in so unaccountable a manner and placed, as it were, by some fiend across your path. As Mr. Kerwin said this, notwithstanding the agitation I endured on this retrospect of my sufferings, I also felt considerable surprise at the knowledge he seemed to possess concerning me. I suppose some astonishment was exhibited in my countenance, for Mr. Kerwin hastened to say, "Immediately upon your being taken ill, all the papers that were on your person were brought to me, and I examined them that I might discover some trace by which I could send to your relations an account of your misfortune and illness. I found several letters, and among others, one which I discovered from its commencement to be from your father. I instantly wrote to Geneva. Nearly 2 months have elapsed since the departure of my letter, but you are ill, even now you tremble, you are unfit for agitation of any kind. This suspense is 1,000 times worse than the most horrible event. Tell me what new scene of death has been acted, and whose murder I am now to lament." "Your family is perfectly well," said Mr. Kerwin with gentleness, "and someone, a friend, is come to visit you." I know not by what chain of thought the idea presented itself, but it instantly darted into my mind that the murderer had come to mock at my misery and taunt me with the death of Clerval as a new incitement for me to comply with his hellish desires. I put my hand before my eyes and cried out in agony, "Oh, take him away! I cannot see him! For God's sake, do not let him enter!" Mr. Kerwin regarded me with a troubled countenance. He could not help regarding my exclamation as a presumption of my guilt, and said, in rather a severe tone, "I should have thought, young man, that the presence of your father would have been welcome instead of inspiring such violent repugnance." "My father!" cried I, while every feature and every muscle was relaxed from anguish to pleasure. "Is my father indeed come? How kind, how very kind! But where is he? Why does he not hasten to me?" My change of manner surprised and pleased the magistrate. Perhaps he thought that my former exclamation was a momentary return of delirium, and now he instantly resumed his former benevolence. He rose and quitted the room with my nurse, and in a moment my father entered it. Nothing at this moment could have given me greater pleasure than the arrival of my father. I stretched out my hand to him and cried, "Are you then safe, and Elizabeth, and Ernest?" My father calmed me with assurances of their welfare, and endeavored by dwelling on these subjects so interesting to my heart to raise my desponding spirits, but he soon felt that a prison cannot be the abode of cheerfulness. "What a place is this that you inhabit, my son," said he, looking mournfully at the barred windows and wretched appearance of the room. "You travel to seek happiness, but a fatality seems to pursue you, and poor Clerval—" The name of my unfortunate and murdered friend was an agitation too great to be endured in my weak state. I shed tears. "Alas, yes, my father," replied I, "some destiny of the most horrible kind hangs over me, and I must live to fulfill it, or surely I should have died on the coffin of Henry." We were not allowed to converse for any length of time, for the precarious state of my health rendered every precaution necessary that could ensure tranquillity. Mr. Kerwin came in and insisted that my strength should not be exhausted by too much exertion. But the appearance of my father was to me like that of my good angel, and I gradually recovered my health. As my sickness quitted me, I was absorbed by a gloomy and black melancholy that nothing could dissipate. The image of Clerval was forever before me, ghastly and murdered. More than once, the agitation into which these reflections threw me made my friends dread a dangerous relapse. Alas, why did they preserve so miserable and detested a life? It was surely that I might fulfill my destiny, which is now drawing to a close. Soon, oh, very soon, will death extinguish these throbbings and relieve me from the mighty weight of anguish that bears me to the dust, and in executing the award of justice, I shall also sink to rest. Then the appearance of death was distant, although the wish was ever present to my thoughts, and I often sat for hours motionless and speechless, wishing for some mighty revolution that might bury me and my destroyer in its ruins. The season of the assizes approached. I had already been 3 months in prison, and although I was still weak and in continual danger of a relapse, I was obliged to travel nearly 100 miles to the county town where the court was held. Mr. Kerwin charged himself with every care of collecting witnesses and arranging my defense. I was spared the disgrace of appearing publicly as a criminal, as the case was not brought before the court that decides on life and death. The grand jury rejected the bill on its being proved that I was on the Orkney Islands at the hour the body of my friend was found. And a fortnight after my removal, I was liberated from prison. My father was enraptured on finding me freed from the vexations of a criminal charge, that I was again allowed to breathe the fresh atmosphere, and permitted to return to my native country. I did not participate in these feelings, for to me the walls of a dungeon or a palace were alike hateful. The cup of life was poisoned forever, and although the sun shone upon me as upon the happy and gay of heart, I saw around me nothing but a dense and frightful darkness, penetrated by no light, but the glimmer of 2 eyes that glared upon me. Sometimes they were the expressive eyes of Henry languishing in death, the dark orbs nearly covered by the lids, and the long black lashes that fringed them. Sometimes it was the watery clouded eyes of the monster as I first saw them in my chamber at Ingolstadt. My father did his best to rekindle the spark of life in me, speaking of Geneva, the place I should soon visit, of Elizabeth and Ernest. But his words only dredged up deep, hollow groans from the pit of my despair. Occasionally, I'd feel a flicker of desire for happiness and think wistfully of my beloved cousin, or long for the blue lake and rapid Rhone that had been so dear to me in childhood. But mostly I was numb, in a torpor where a prison cell felt as comforting as the most divine landscape. Rarely the numbness broke into paroxysms of anguish and despair, during which I often tried to end my own existence. It took constant vigilance from those around me to prevent some dreadful act of violence. Yet, one duty kept me from succumbing entirely to my selfish despair. I needed to return to Geneva, to watch over those I loved and wait for the murderer. If fate led me to him, or if he dared show himself again, I wanted to be ready to end his monstrous existence. My father, seeing my shattered state, feared I couldn't handle the journey. I was a mere skeleton, fevered and weak. But my insistence on leaving Ireland was relentless, and my father finally agreed it was best to yield to my urgent pleas. We booked passage on a vessel bound for Havre de Grace and sailed from Ireland under a fair wind. It was midnight, and I lay on the deck, staring at the stars, listening to the waves. The darkness that enveloped Ireland felt like a shroud lifting from my soul, and a feverish joy beat in my pulse at the thought of seeing Geneva again. The past felt like a nightmarish dream, yet the ship, the wind, and the sea were too real, reminding me that Clerval, my dearest friend, had fallen victim to me and my creation. I replayed my life in my mind, the quiet happiness in Geneva, my mother's death, my departure for Ingolstadt, and the mad enthusiasm that drove me to create my hideous enemy. The memory of the night he first lived made me shudder, and a flood of emotions overwhelmed me, bringing tears. Since recovering from my fever, I'd relied on laudanum to sleep. Without it, rest eluded me, and life's preservation depended on those few hours of oblivion. That night, crushed by my memories, I swallowed double my usual dose. Sleep claimed me quickly, but it was no escape. My dreams were haunted by 1,000 terrors. Towards morning, I fell into a nightmare. I felt the fiend's grip on my neck, his presence inescapable, my ears ringing with groans and cries. My father, who kept vigil, noticed my restlessness and woke me. The dashing waves and cloudy sky brought me back to reality. The fiend was not here. A fleeting sense of security washed over me, a temporary truce between the present and the dark future. This brief calm was a forgetfulness that only the fragile human mind can know. Yet the shadows lurked just beyond, waiting for the next moment to plunge me back into the abyss. Chapter 21. In my desperation for escape, I doubled my usual dose of laudanum, hoping for a respite from my tormented mind. But even sleep betrayed me, delivering nightmares where I felt the fiend's grip on my neck, heard his chilling laughter. My father, ever watchful, roused me from this hellish slumber. The night had turned to day, and for a fleeting moment I felt a fragile sense of security. As the ship docked and we made our way to Paris, my frailty became evident. My father, a relentless caregiver, tried to nurse me back to health, but he was treating the symptoms, not the disease. He suggested mingling with society, oblivious to my aversion. People, once sources of comfort, now filled me with dread. I had unleashed a killer among them, a monster thriving on their despair. How could I face them, knowing the blood on my hands? Eventually, my father accepted my need for isolation, though he never stopped trying to lift my spirits. He thought I was tormented by the murder accusation, and he tried to alleviate my perceived shame. "Alas, my father," I said, how little you know me. If only pride were my torment. Justine was innocent, yet she suffered the same charge. She died because of me. William, Justine, Henry, they all died because of me. He'd heard my self-accusations before, and sometimes he wanted to understand, other times he dismissed them as feverish ravings. I stayed silent about the true horror, fearing he'd think me mad. The truth was too ghastly to share, so I bore the weight alone. One day he looked at me with a mix of sadness and disbelief. "My dearest Victor, what madness is this? Please, never say such things again." "I am not mad," I cried. "The sun, the heavens, they've witnessed my crimes. I am the murderer of those innocents. I'd have given my own life to save them, but I couldn't sacrifice all of humanity." Convinced of my madness, my father changed the subject, trying to erase the horrors from my mind. Over time, I grew calmer, though misery still festered in my heart. I no longer ranted about my crimes. The burden of their memory was enough. I forced myself into a semblance of composure, more stable than I'd been since my journey to the Arctic. Just before we left Paris for Switzerland, I received a letter from Elizabeth. Elizabeth's letter. "Victor, your uncle's letter brought immense relief. You're closer now, and I hope to see you soon. My poor cousin, you must have endured so much. This winter has been agonizing, filled with anxious waiting. I hope to see peace in your face, and that your heart isn't entirely void of comfort. But I worry the same feelings that plagued you a year ago still torment you. A conversation with your uncle makes it necessary for me to speak plainly. Our union has been planned since childhood. We were told to expect it. We were affectionate playmates, and as we grew, we became dear friends. But like siblings who love each other without romantic desire, could this be our fate? Tell me, Victor, for our mutual happiness, do you love another?" As I read her words, my heart ached. Elizabeth's sincerity pierced through my gloom, but the weight of my secret and the horror of my creation loomed over any chance of happiness. How could I respond? How could I confess the truth without dragging her into my nightmarish reality? "Do you have someone else?" Elizabeth's voice was barely above a whisper, her eyes searching mine for any flicker of deceit. "No, Elizabeth, none," I replied firmly. "You're my only love. I look forward to our union with all my heart. Let's set the date, and I swear, in life or death, to devote myself to your happiness." "My dear Victor, don't talk like that," my father interjected, his voice laden with concern. "We've faced so many misfortunes. Let's cling to the love we have left. Our circle may be small, but it's tight-knit, strengthened by our shared grief. In time, new joys will come to replace what we've lost." His words were meant to console, but they only reminded me of the fiend's ominous promise. "I shall be with you on your wedding night." The monster's deeds had been so terrifyingly effective that I couldn't help but see him as invincible. Yet death held no fear for me if it meant saving Elizabeth. I agreed with my father, feigning cheerfulness, to marry Elizabeth in 10 days, feeling as though I was sealing my own fate. If I had truly grasped the monster's intent, I would have fled forever, wandering the earth as a lonely outcast, rather than consenting to this cursed marriage. But his malevolent influence clouded my judgment, and in my delusion, I hastened the demise of the one I loved most. As the wedding approached, dread gnawed at my heart. I masked my fear with forced smiles, which brought some relief to my father, but failed to deceive Elizabeth's keen intuition. She sensed the underlying tension, her contentment tinged with apprehension, fearing that our hoped-for happiness was but a fragile dream. Preparations for the wedding proceeded, and congratulations poured in. I buried my anxiety and played along with my father's plans, though they felt like decorations on my own impending tragedy. Thanks to my father's efforts, Elizabeth regained part of her inheritance, a small estate on Lake Como. We planned to spend our honeymoon there, imagining fleeting moments of happiness by the serene lake. I took every precaution, carrying pistols and a dagger, always alert to prevent any ambush. These measures brought me a semblance of peace. As the day neared, the threat seemed less real, overshadowed by the tangible joy of the upcoming marriage. Elizabeth appeared happy, my calm demeanor easing her mind. But on our wedding day, her unease returned. Perhaps she sensed the terrible secret I would reveal the next day. My father, busy with the preparations, mistook her melancholy for bridal nerves. After the ceremony, a large party gathered at my father's house. Elizabeth and I planned to start our journey by water, spending the night at Evian before continuing. The day was beautiful, the wind favorable, and everything seemed to smile on our nuptial voyage. These were the last moments of genuine happiness I would ever feel. As we sailed, the sun warmed us, but we were shaded by a canopy, enjoying the stunning scenery. On one side, we saw Mont Salève and Montalegre, on the other, the imposing Jura Mountains. Taking Elizabeth's hand, I said, "You seem sorrowful, my love. If you knew what I've suffered and what I might still endure, you'd let me savor this brief moment of peace." "Be happy, Victor," she replied softly. "I hope there's nothing to distress you. Though I don't show it, my heart is content." Something warns me not to trust our future too much, but I won't listen to such a sinister voice. Look how fast we move, how the clouds play around Mont Blanc. And see the fish in the clear water, how they swim so freely. What a divine day, how serene everything seems. Elizabeth tried to lift our spirits, but her mood was mercurial. Moments of joy were quickly replaced by distraction and reverie. As the sun set, we neared Evian. The wind that had sped us along became a gentle breeze, ruffling the water and filling the air with the scent of flowers and hay. We docked as twilight descended, and as I stepped ashore, a sense of foreboding gripped me, heralding the unending torment soon to come. Chapter 22. It was 8 o'clock when we finally landed. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving the world cloaked in the eerie twilight that lingers just before true nightfall. Elizabeth and I strolled along the shore, trying to savor the fleeting serenity, but the peace was tainted, as if the very air was thick with foreboding. By the time we reached the inn, the wind had shifted, howling now from the west with a vengeance. The moon, once a silver sentinel, was shrouded by clouds racing across the sky like phantom vultures. The lake mirrored the chaotic heavens, its surface churned by restless waves. Suddenly, the sky opened, unleashing a torrential downpour. Throughout the day, I had maintained a fragile calm, but as darkness enveloped us, fear crept in. I clutched the pistol hidden in my jacket, my senses heightened. Every creak of the inn, every rustle of leaves outside sent my heart racing. I was determined to fight, to sell my life dearly if it came to that. Elizabeth, sensing my distress, finally spoke in a trembling voice. "Victor, what is it? What are you afraid of?" I tried to soothe her. "Nothing, my love. Just tonight. We need to get through tonight and everything will be fine." An hour crawled by, each minute stretching into eternity. I couldn't shake the dread, knowing how horrifying any confrontation with the creature would be for Elizabeth. I begged her to go to bed, promising to join her once I had scouted the inn. Reluctantly, she agreed, her eyes wide with worry. I paced the hallways, checking every shadowed corner, every potential hiding place. Nothing. Just as I started to believe that perhaps luck was on our side, a blood-curdling scream shattered the night. Elizabeth's scream. In an instant, I was paralyzed, every muscle frozen as the horrific reality sunk in. Then the scream echoed again, and I sprinted to her room. The scene that greeted me was worse than any nightmare. Elizabeth lay lifeless across the bed, her head hanging limply, her beautiful features contorted in terror, half hidden by her disheveled hair. For a moment, I wished for death. Why wasn't I struck down by the sheer agony of it? Her bloodless arms, her twisted form, the reality was too monstrous to bear. I collapsed beside her, losing consciousness briefly. When I came to, the room was filled with the inn's staff, their faces masks of fear. Their horror felt like a cruel parody compared to the abyss of grief consuming me. I broke away from them, returning to Elizabeth. She had been moved slightly, her head resting on her arm, a handkerchief draped over her face. She looked almost asleep, but the cold rigidity of her body was unmistakable. The fiend's mark was around her neck, a grim signature of his vengeance. As I hovered over her, consumed by despair, the moon's pale light suddenly flooded the room. Someone had thrown open the shutters, and there, framed in the window, was the creature. His face twisted into a grotesque grin, he pointed mockingly at Elizabeth's body. Rage fueled me. I grabbed my pistol and fired. The bullet missed. The monster vanished, leaping from the window and sprinting towards the lake with inhuman speed. The gunshot brought others rushing in. I pointed wildly towards the window, screaming that he had escaped into the water. Boats were launched, nets cast, but it was futile. After hours of searching, we returned empty-handed. Many dismissed it as a figment of my shattered mind. Back on land, search parties fanned out into the surrounding woods and vineyards. I stood alone, staring into the night, knowing the horror wasn't over. The monster's threat echoed in my mind. I shall be with you on your wedding night. Now it was a promise fulfilled, and I was left to endure the aftermath of his hellish deed. I tried to follow them, but my head spun like I was on a merry-go-round from hell. My legs wobbled, and I stumbled like a drunk, collapsing in utter exhaustion. Fever had me in its grip, and a haze clouded my vision. I barely registered being carried back and placed on a bed, my eyes darting around the room as if searching for something I'd lost. After a while, I managed to drag myself to the room where Elizabeth's lifeless body lay. Women were weeping around her, and I joined them, my tears mixing with theirs. My mind was a chaotic whirlpool of horror and confusion. William's death, Justine's execution, Clerval's murder, and now my beloved wife, all these tragedies swirled together in my brain, and the fear gnawed at me. Was my father safe? Was Ernest still alive? The thought jolted me back to action. I had to return to Geneva. There were no horses, and the wind was howling with rain pounding down in torrents. The only way back was by boat. It was still early morning, so I hoped to reach home by nightfall. I hired some men to row and took an oar myself, thinking physical exertion might distract me from my torment. But the misery was too great. I couldn't keep up. I dropped the oar, resting my head in my hands, letting every dark thought flood my mind. I looked up, seeing the familiar landscapes that had once brought me joy, now tainted by Elizabeth's absence. Tears streamed down my face. The rain paused for a moment, and I saw fish playing in the water, the same fish Elizabeth had pointed out just hours before. Nothing is more painful than a sudden drastic change. The fiend had stolen every bit of my happiness, leaving me the most miserable soul alive. There's no need to dwell on the events that followed. My life has been a series of horrors, and I've reached the climax of my nightmare. Let me summarize the rest. One by one, my friends were taken from me, leaving me utterly alone. My strength was gone, and I must finish this story quickly. I made it back to Geneva. My father and Ernest were alive, but my father couldn't bear the news I brought. I see him now, his vacant eyes, having lost their sparkle with the death of Elizabeth, the one he adored most. The fiend's curse had drained the life from him, and within days he died in my arms. What became of me? I don't know. I lost all sense of reality. Darkness and chains were my only companions. Sometimes I dreamt of wandering in meadows with friends from my youth, only to wake in a dungeon. Slowly, I grasped the full extent of my misery and was released from my prison. They thought I was mad, and I'd spent months in solitary confinement. Freedom was meaningless without revenge. As I regained my sanity, so did my thirst for vengeance. I remembered the monster I had created, the demon I had unleashed upon the world. Rage consumed me. I prayed fervently to have him within my grasp, to exact my revenge on his cursed head. My hatred drove me to action. About a month after my release, I sought out a criminal judge, telling him I had an accusation to make. I knew the destroyer of my family and demanded that he use all his power to apprehend the murderer. The magistrate listened to me with a mix of curiosity and pity, like someone tuning into a late-night true crime podcast. "Rest assured, sir," he said, his voice steady and calm. "I will spare no effort to track down this villain." "Thank you," I replied, my voice tinged with a desperation I could barely contain. "Hear my deposition. It's a tale so bizarre you might think it a fever dream, but truth, no matter how twisted, demands belief. The story is too detailed to be a hallucination, and I have no reason to lie." My tone was calm, yet determined, fueled by a fierce resolve to hunt my destroyer to the ends of the earth. This purpose gave me a strange sort of peace, a reason to go on living for now. I recounted my history succinctly, my voice unwavering. Dates, places, and events rolled off my tongue with eerie precision. The magistrate, initially skeptical, began to lean in, his expression shifting from doubt to horrified fascination. He shuddered at times, his eyes widening in shock, yet disbelief did not cloud his face. When I finished, I looked him in the eye. "This is the being I accuse. I demand you use your authority to capture and punish him. It is your duty as a magistrate, and as a human being, I trust you won't shy away from this responsibility." His face shifted, skepticism returning. He had listened like one would to a ghost story, but now that action was required, doubt resurfaced. Still, he responded gently, "I wish to help, but this creature you describe has abilities that seem beyond our means to combat. Who can chase a beast that roams glaciers and hides in caves no man would dare enter? Months have passed since his last crime. Who knows where he might be now? I believe he is close, lurking near. If he's taken refuge in the Alps, he can be hunted down like any other predator. But I see it in your eyes. You don't believe me, and you won't pursue him." Anger flared within me, my eyes burning with rage. The magistrate flinched. "You're wrong," he stammered. "I will do everything in my power to catch him, but from what you've described, it seems nearly impossible. We will take all appropriate measures, but you must brace yourself for possible disappointment." "That cannot be," I snapped. My revenge is my only drive. I know it's a vice, but it's the fire that keeps me alive. The thought that this murderer, this abomination, still walks free infuriates me. You deny me justice, but I will dedicate my life, or my death, to his destruction. I trembled with a mix of rage and a manic intensity. I must have looked like a madman, a modern-day avenger on a path of destruction. The magistrate, rooted in his mundane reality, saw only madness. He tried to calm me, treating me like a child in the throes of a tantrum, dismissing my tale as the ravings of a fevered mind. "Man," I shouted, my voice echoing with despair and anger, "how blind you are in your self-righteous wisdom! Stop speaking! You know nothing!" I stormed out of the house, my mind a whirlwind of fury and determination, already plotting my next move. Chapter 23. My current state was one where voluntary thought was drowned by a torrent of fury. Revenge was the only thing keeping me grounded, lending me an eerie strength and an unsettling calm when I should have been lost to delirium or death. First, I resolved to leave Geneva for good. The country that had once been my beloved sanctuary now felt like a prison. I gathered a sum of money and a few precious jewels that had belonged to my mother and departed, feeling the weight of my grief pushing me onward. Thus began my relentless wanderings, a journey with no end but death. I traversed countless miles of the earth, enduring the hardships of deserts and barbarous lands. How I survived, I can hardly say. There were many times I collapsed on desolate plains, praying for the release of death. Yet the burning need for revenge kept me alive. I couldn't die and leave my adversary unpunished. When I left Geneva, my first task was to find some clue to track my monstrous enemy. But my plan was nebulous, and I spent hours wandering the town's outskirts, unsure of which path to take. As night fell, I found myself at the cemetery entrance where William, Elizabeth, and my father lay. I entered and approached their graves. Silence enveloped me, broken only by the rustling leaves. The night was nearly pitch black, making the scene somber and haunting. To any observer, it would have been a solemn, moving sight. To me, it felt as if the spirits of the dead were all around, casting an unseen shadow over my mourning. The deep grief that initially gripped me quickly morphed into seething rage and despair. They were dead, yet I lived. Their murderer lived too, and to destroy him, I had to drag out my miserable existence. Kneeling on the grass, I kissed the earth, and with trembling lips, I swore an oath. By the sacred earth on which I kneel, by the spirits that wander near me, by the deep and eternal grief that consumes me, I swear, by you, O night, and the spirits that rule you, to hunt down the demon who brought this suffering until one of us perishes. For this mission, I will cling to life. To fulfill this revenge, I will again see the sun and walk the green earth, which otherwise would vanish from my sight forever. Spirits of the dead, wandering ministers of vengeance, aid me in my task. Let the cursed monster taste deep agony. Let him feel the despair that now torments me. I began my vow with a solemnity that almost convinced me my murdered loved ones heard and approved my dedication. But as I finished, fury took over, choking my words. Suddenly, through the night's stillness, a loud, fiendish laugh rang out. It echoed in my ears and off the mountains, enveloping me in a mockery from hell itself. In that moment, I nearly succumbed to madness and ended my wretched existence, but my vow anchored me. The laughter faded, and then a familiar loathsome voice whispered close to my ear, "I am satisfied, miserable wretch. You have chosen to live, and I am satisfied." I lunged towards the sound, but the devil slipped away. The moon's broad disk rose, casting light on his ghastly fleeing shape. I chased him, and for months this was my life. Following faint clues, I traced the windings of the Rhone, but in vain. The blue Mediterranean came into view, and by some cruel twist of fate, I saw the fiend boarding a ship bound for the Black Sea. I secured the passage on the same vessel, but somehow he eluded me again. Chasing him through the icy wilderness of modern-day Russia and Mongolia, I could feel the sinister pull of my prey. Despite his efforts to stay hidden, I relentlessly followed the trail of the beast who had wrecked my life. Sometimes, terrified villagers pointed me in the right direction, their faces pale with fear from the horror they'd glimpsed. Other times, he left deliberate signs, almost as if he wanted to ensure I didn't give up and die before he could finish what he started. His giant footprints in the snow were a constant reminder of my hellish pursuit. You, young and untouched by true agony, can't possibly understand the torment I endure. Cold, hunger, and exhaustion are the least of my sufferings. I carry an inferno within me, a personal hell that never cools. Yet there's also a strange, almost divine force guiding my steps, pulling me from the brink of despair when all seems lost. When hunger gnawed at me, I would find a simple meal left in the wilderness, as if some benevolent spirit heard my silent pleas. When thirst parched my throat, a brief rain shower would provide just enough relief to keep me moving. I followed the rivers when I could, but he often avoided them, knowing they were gathering spots for locals. In more isolated areas, I hunted wild game for sustenance. Money helped me win over the occasional villager, trading for fire and cooking tools. My life was a desolate march, a grim parody of existence. Only in sleep did I find any solace, dreaming of loved ones and a past life now lost. Each night, those dreams restored just enough of my spirit to face another day of this infernal quest. Sometimes I found messages from him carved into tree bark or etched into stones. "My reign is not yet over," one read. "You live, and my power is complete. Follow me, I seek the everlasting ice of the north, where you will feel the misery of cold and frost to which I am immune. Near this place, if you follow not too tardily, you will find a dead hare. Eat and be refreshed. Come on, my enemy, we have yet to wrestle for our lives, but many hard and miserable hours must you endure until that period shall arrive." A demonic taunt, but one that fueled my vengeance. I swore I'd hunt him to the ends of the earth. As the snow deepened and the cold became almost unbearable, I pressed on. The peasants locked themselves away from the bitter chill, and only the bravest dared to venture out, hunting the starving animals. The rivers froze, cutting off my main food source. Yet, the more difficult my journey became, the more I burned with a relentless fury. His messages mocked my efforts, but they also stoked my resolve. "Prepare, your toils only begin. Wrap yourself in furs and provide food, for we shall soon enter upon a journey where your sufferings will satisfy my everlasting hatred." Invigorated by his cruel words, I called upon whatever higher power might be listening and continued my pursuit. Eventually, the ocean appeared on the horizon, a vast expanse of ice unlike the warm, inviting waters of the south. I didn't weep upon seeing it. I knelt and thanked whatever guiding spirit had brought me safely to this final frontier. A few weeks before reaching the coast, I acquired a sledge and a team of dogs, which allowed me to cross the frozen terrain with incredible speed. Despite not knowing if the fiend had similar advantages, I found myself gaining on him. When I first sighted the ocean, he was only a day ahead. Fueled by new hope, I pushed on and reached a small desolate hamlet by the shore. The locals told me of a monstrous figure that had arrived the previous night, armed to the teeth, scaring the inhabitants away and stealing their winter supplies. He had harnessed a team of dogs to a sledge and set off across the ice, heading towards a landless horizon. They assumed he would soon perish in the frozen wasteland. Despair threatened to engulf me. He had escaped once more, leaving me to face an almost impossible journey across the ice. Yet, the thought of him living on, victorious, reignited my rage. After a brief rest, I prepared for the next leg of my pursuit, exchanging my sledge for one suited to the treacherous conditions of the frozen ocean and stocking up on provisions. I've lost count of the days since then. Misery has been my constant companion, and only the burning desire for vengeance keeps me going. Vast ice mountains often block my path, and the ground sea's thunderous roars threaten my demise. But the frost always returns, solidifying the way forward. As I press on, I can only hope the end of this nightmare is near, whether in victory or death. After what felt like an eternity battling the savage elements of the Arctic, I guessed I'd been chasing my nemesis across the ice for 3 harrowing weeks. Each day dragged, a string of hope pulled taut enough to snap, often leaving me weeping with frustration and despair. The journey had nearly broken me. After a grueling climb up an icy incline, one of my faithful dogs collapsed, dead from exhaustion. As I stood surveying the bleak horizon, a speck caught my eye, a dark, distant shape that set my pulse racing. It was him, my tormentor, visible at last on his own sledge. Hope surged hot through my veins, melting the despair that had iced over my heart. I quickly tended to the remaining dogs, sparing them their fallen comrade's burden and feeding them generously before taking a mandatory agonizing rest. When we resumed, the sight of his sledge was like a beacon guiding my relentless pursuit. For 2 days, I closed the gap between us until he was barely a mile away. My heart soared with the proximity of vengeance. But as victory loomed, it was snatched away by the cruel hands of fate. The sea beneath us roared alive, a monstrous ground sea that threatened to devour everything in its path. The ice cracked with the ferocity of 1,000 thunders, and within moments a chaotic expanse of water separated me from my quarry. I was left adrift on a dwindling floe, surrounded by the dying cries of my dogs and staring down my own looming demise. Time warped as I floated on that frigid deathbed. But just when all seemed lost, salvation appeared in the form of your ship, anchored against the odds in these forsaken waters. Desperation lent me the strength to tear apart what remained of my sledge to fashion makeshift oars. With these, I paddled towards you, driven by the single purpose that has sustained me this far. I had planned to ask you for a boat to continue my pursuit if you were headed south. Yet, here you are, journeying northward, pulling me aboard just as my body and spirit were about to give out. My quest is still unmet, my soul unrested. Can it be that even in death I must chase this spectre? I implore you, Walton, should I perish before my task is done, you must not let him escape. Do not heed his cunning words. They are as venomous as his deeds are vile. Should fate bring him into your path, remember my fallen loved ones, William, Justine, Clerval, Elizabeth, my father, and the tortured soul that is Victor Frankenstein. Do not hesitate. Strike him down. Fulfill my last request. Let not this demon from my nightmares outlive the torment he has sown. If my spirit lingers, it will guide your hand. Swear to me, Walton, swear on whatever hope or horror brought you to these icy ends of the earth, that you will finish what I could not. Walton's Journal, August 26th. Dear Margaret, you've read this tale, haven't you? That twisted, nightmarish saga. Do you feel it too? That chill creeping down your spine, the icy grip of dread that even now makes my skin crawl? Sometimes he'd be overtaken by sheer agony, unable to continue. Other times, his voice, cracked but piercing, would push through, each word dripping with torment. His eyes, once bright with indignation, now drowned in sorrow, flickering with an almost otherworldly despair. There were moments he'd recount the horrors with a calm, collected demeanor, his face a mask of tranquility. But then, like a volcano, his expression would erupt into wild rage, curses spilling forth as if they could summon the devil himself. His story was coherent, each thread woven tightly together, yet the letters from Felix and Safi he showed me, and the monster's apparition from our ship, gave weight to his words more than his earnestness ever could. A monster truly exists, I cannot doubt it, yet I am lost in a mixture of shock and awe. Occasionally, I'd press Frankenstein for the secrets of his creature's creation, but he remained resolutely silent. Are you mad? He'd ask. Why would you seek such knowledge? Do you wish to unleash another demon upon the world? No, learn from my misery. Do not add to your own. When he discovered my notes, he demanded to see them. He corrected and added to them, particularly fleshing out his exchanges with his enemy. If you're to record my tale, he said, let it be whole, not some butchered version. A week has slipped by as I've absorbed this bizarre story. Every fiber of my being is consumed by my guest's plight, his refined manners a stark contrast to the dark narrative he spun. I wish I could comfort him, but how can I suggest that someone so utterly destitute find solace in life? His only comfort, born of solitude and madness, is the belief that his departed friends visit him in dreams, offering consolation or spurring him to vengeance. To him, these aren't mere figments, but real entities from another realm. This conviction lends a haunting authenticity to his reveries. Our talks aren't solely about his past. His knowledge spans all of literature, his intellect sharp and insightful, his eloquence moves me deeply, bringing tears to my eyes when he speaks of love or sorrow. What a magnificent being he must have been in his prime, noble even in ruin. He recognizes his own worth, even as he laments his fall from grace. When I was younger, he confessed, I believed I was destined for greatness. My feelings were deep, but my judgment was cool and precise, priming me for great achievements. This belief in my worth sustained me when others might have crumbled. I saw it as a sin to waste my talents in grief. When I created a sentient being, I didn't see myself as a mere dreamer. But now, this thought that once lifted me high plunges me into despair. All my hopes are ashes. I am like the fallen angel, trapped in an eternal hell. My imagination was vivid, my analytical skills sharp. These combined to birth my creation. Even now, I can't recall those days without a surge of passion. I felt like I was walking in heaven, exulting in my power. From my youth, I was filled with ambition, but now look at me. If you had known me then, you wouldn't recognize the wreck I've become. Rarely did despair touch my heart. I seemed destined for greatness until I fell, never to rise again. Must I lose this remarkable being? I've longed for a friend, a confidant. On these desolate seas, I found such a one, but I fear I've discovered his value only to lose him. I'd convince him to embrace life, but he resists. Thank you, Walton, he said, for your kindness to a wretch like me. But when you speak of new ties and affections, remember, none can replace those I've lost. Can anyone be to me what Clerval was, or any woman another Elizabeth? Even siblings cannot match the bond of childhood friends who know our deepest selves. These friends were dear not just by habit but by their merits. Wherever I go, Elizabeth's voice and Clerval's conversation haunt me. They are gone, and only a desperate need compels me to live. If I had a grand purpose to benefit humanity, I could survive, but I must pursue and destroy the being I created. Only then will my earthly task be complete and I can die. Walton's Journal, September 2nd. Dear Margaret, I write to you now, surrounded by a frozen nightmare, unsure if I'll ever see England or my loved ones again. Our ship is ensnared by towering icebergs, each one a threat to crush us into oblivion. The brave men who trusted me enough to join this ill-fated expedition now look to me for salvation, but I have none to offer. The sheer terror of our predicament is overwhelming, yet my courage remains unbroken. It's unbearable to think that my reckless ambition has put all their lives at risk. If we perish, it's my dreams that have doomed us. And you, Margaret, what will you feel? You won't know our fate and will be left in agonizing uncertainty, hoping and despairing in equal measure. The thought of your suffering torments me more than my own potential demise, but you have a family. May they bring you comfort and happiness. Heaven bless you all. My unfortunate guest, Frankenstein, shows me nothing but compassion. He tries to instill hope in me, speaking as if life is still precious. He recounts how other explorers have faced similar dangers and emerged unscathed. His words uplift the crew, if only momentarily. His eloquence is almost magical. When he speaks, the men seem to forget their despair, seeing the ice as mere obstacles to be overcome. But as each day passes without escape, fear gnaws at them, and I dread the mutiny that their desperation might incite. Bah, September 5th. An extraordinary scene has unfolded, and though these words may never reach you, I must record it. We remain encased in ice, the threat of annihilation looming over us. The cold is relentless, claiming the lives of several crew members. Frankenstein's health deteriorates daily. His eyes still burn with fever, but his body is frail and failing. In my last letter, I mentioned the growing fear of a mutiny. This morning, while I watched over Frankenstein, half conscious and lifeless, a group of sailors barged into the cabin. Their leader, speaking for the rest, demanded that we abandon our mission if freed from the ice. They feared that I would push them further into danger should we escape this frozen trap. They demanded a promise that if the ice relented, we would turn south immediately. Their request troubled me deeply. I had not given up hope, nor had I considered retreat. But could I, in good conscience, refuse them? As I hesitated, Frankenstein, who had been silent and seemingly unaware, suddenly roused himself. His eyes sparked with a fierce energy as he addressed the men. "What do you ask of your captain?" he demanded. "Are you so quick to abandon your quest? Did you not embark on this voyage for its glory, not because the path was easy, but because it was fraught with peril? You sought honor through bravery, yet now you cower at the first true test of your courage. Do not return to your homes branded as cowards. Stand firm and be the heroes you set out to be. This ice is no match for the strength of your resolve." His words, imbued with a fiery resolve and eloquence, left the men speechless. I then told them to consider his words carefully. I promised that I would not force them north against their will, but hoped that their courage would return with reflection. The men left, and I turned back to Frankenstein. He had expended all his energy and seemed barely alive. How will this end? I do not know. I would rather die than return defeated, my mission unfulfilled. Yet I fear the man, without a sense of glory and honor, cannot endure the hardships we face much longer. Portbou, September 7th. The decision is made. If we aren't obliterated by the ice, we're turning back. my dreams shattered by fear and indecision, I'm heading back with nothing but disappointment. It takes a kind of stoic endurance I don't possess to stomach this injustice. Ha! September 12th. It's over. We're heading back to England. My dreams of greatness and discovery are dashed. I've lost not only my hope, but also a friend. But, my dear sister, as we sail back to England, I'll try to detail the bitter events for you. On September 9th, the ice began to shift and groan like the earth itself was crying out. It cracked and split around us, putting us in mortal danger. All we could do was remain passive, our fate sealed by nature's whim. My attention was fixated on Frankenstein, whose illness had confined him to bed. As the ice cracked behind us, the ship was thrust northward. On the 11th, a breeze from the west opened a clear passage south. The crew erupted in joyous shouts at the sight of their seemingly assured return to England. Frankenstein, roused from his feverish doze, asked about the commotion. "They're celebrating," I told him, "because we're going back to England." "Are we really turning back?" he asked. "Alas, yes," I said. "I can't ignore their demands. I can't lead them into danger against their will." "Do what you must," he replied with a sorrowful resolve, "but I won't abandon my quest. My purpose is divine, and I can't turn back. I may be weak, but the spirits that drive my vengeance will give me strength." He tried to rise from the bed, but the effort was too much. He collapsed back, unconscious. It was a long time before he regained consciousness, and I often feared he was dead. When he finally opened his eyes, he was too weak to speak. The surgeon gave him a sedative and instructed us to let him rest. Later, he told me that Frankenstein had only a few hours left to live. I could do nothing but grieve and wait. I sat by his bed, watching over him as he drifted in and out of sleep. When he woke, he called me over in a faint voice. "The strength I once relied on is gone," he said. "I feel my end approaching, and my enemy, my tormentor, still lives. Do not think, Walton, that I still harbor that burning hatred and desire for revenge, but I do feel justified in wanting him dead. In these final days, I've reflected on my past actions and found no fault in them. In a fit of madness, I created a rational being and was responsible for ensuring his happiness. That was my duty, but my duty to humanity was greater. That's why I refused to create a companion for the creature. He showed nothing but cruelty and selfishness, destroying my friends and ruining lives. His thirst for vengeance must end. He must die. It was my task, but I have failed. I once asked you out of selfishness to take on my mission. Now I ask you out of reason and virtue." Frankenstein's voice, though weakened, was resolute. "I cannot ask you to give up your life and your dreams to pursue my vengeance. But if fate brings you face to face with the creature, remember my plea. Do not let him leave. He is eloquent and persuasive, but trust him not. Remember William, Justine, Clerval, Elizabeth, and me. And if the moment comes, end his existence. It's the only way to stop the madness." With those words, his strength ebbed, and his eyes closed for the last time. I watched as a gentle smile flickered across his lips and then faded. The light in his eyes dimmed, and he was gone. Margaret, what words can express the depth of my sorrow? I've lost a friend and seen dreams turn to dust. We're heading back to England, but I wonder if I will ever truly find solace. The nightmare is over, but its shadows linger. As the Arctic wind howls outside, I can't help but feel that we're leaving a part of ourselves behind in this icy wasteland. Farewell, dear sister. I hope these words reach you and convey my love and despair. Good night, Margaret. The Arctic sun sets, drawing a curtain on my ambitions, perhaps forever. Mark stood over a hospital bed that had seen better days. The room was a mix of sterile white and the grimy fingerprints of neglect. Fluorescent lights flickered, casting a sickly glow on the waxy face of Victor, his breath shallow, eyes dull with the finality of his last moments. Mark's voice wavered, a raspy whisper in the stillness. "I can't ask you to abandon everything for this hunt. You're going back to New York. Your chances of crossing paths with him are slim to none. Weigh your duties carefully. My mind's too clouded by the nearness of death to trust my own judgment. I can't ask you to do what I think is right. My passion might be leading me astray." Victor's frail hand twitched. That he should continue wreaking havoc haunts me, but now, at this brink, this moment brings me more peace than I've known in years. The faces of those I've lost dance before me, calling me home. Goodbye, Mark. Find your peace in a quiet life. Avoid the snares of ambition, even the noble kind. Look at me, ruined by my own dreams. Maybe someone else can succeed where I failed. His voice faded, a ghost of sound, until silence swallowed the room. Minutes ticked by, and Victor's hand grew cold in Mark's grasp, a final smile fading like a shadow. Mark turned away, tears blurring his vision. "Margaret, how do I capture this grief? Words are too weak. My soul is weighed down by loss, yet I head back to New York, hoping for solace." He froze. The ship's deck was eerily quiet under the full moon, a spectral glow washing over everything. A strange noise, hoarse and human, echoed from the cabin where Victor lay. Mark's heart pounded as he approached. What greeted him was a sight pulled from a nightmare. A towering figure, grotesque and malformed, loomed over Victor's body. Its face was a mask of horror, framed by wild, matted hair. A massive hand, leathery and decayed, caressed Victor's cheek. At Mark's approach, the creature turned, revealing a visage of unspeakable ugliness. "Stay!" Mark commanded, his voice trembling. The creature paused, a flash of confusion in its eyes. Then, with a guttural cry, it turned back to Victor's corpse, rage twisting its features. "He was my creator, my tormentor. In his death, my crimes are complete. Frankenstein, you noble fool, what good is your forgiveness now? You, who I destroyed by taking all you loved. But you can't answer me anymore." Mark, shaken but curious, took a step closer. "Your remorse is too late. If you'd heeded your conscience earlier, Victor would still live." The creature's voice broke. "Do you think I felt no remorse? He suffered, but not a fraction of my agony. I was driven by hatred, yet burdened by a heart capable of love. My vengeance was my only solace. When I killed Clerval, I felt horror at my own actions. I hated Frankenstein, not because he deserved it, but because he dared hope for happiness while I was condemned to misery. And when she died, I was beyond misery. Evil became my refuge. Now it's over." Mark's anger flared. "Wretch, you mourn now, but it's too late. You torched our lives, then weep over the ashes. Hypocrite! If Victor were alive, you'd still torment him." The creature's face contorted. "No, you don't understand. I sought love and virtue, but found only hatred. Now, crime is my only legacy. I've murdered innocence, destroyed my creator, and now even I cannot forgive myself. My existence has been a series of unending torment. I desired love, but was met with scorn. Why do you not hate those who wronged me first? I was spurned and despised by all. I am an abomination, cursed and alone." Mark's resolve hardened. "You're right. You are a monster, but not because of your appearance. It's your actions that damn you. You are beyond redemption." The creature's eyes burned with a resigned fury. "I know, my work is done. I'll disappear into the northern wastes, build my funeral pyre, and end this misery. No one will create another like me. I'll be forgotten, just as I wish. The sun, the stars, the winds, all will fade for me. Death is my only peace." With that, the creature leapt from the cabin window, disappearing into the icy void. Mark watched, the weight of what he witnessed pressing down on him. The memory of Victor and his monstrous creation would haunt him forever, a dark stain on his soul. The end had come, but the horror would never leave. The city outside continued its restless pulse, oblivious to the dark tale that had just reached its tragic conclusion.
Thank you for listening to Frankenstein Reimagined. We hope you have enjoyed this audiobook. If so, please like, share, or comment. By doing so, you can help others find this channel, and it will help us grow our community. Also, let us know in the comments what classic books you would like to hear reimagined through the lens of your favorite modern author, and we will try to make it happen soon.